The silence at the 11th hour. At 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. For 4 years the sound had been constant. Artillery that shook the earth, machine guns that stitched fields into graves, whistles that sent men over the top and into the teeth of fire. Then, with a signature on paper and a synchronized clock, the thunder died. What lingered in its place was not relief alone, but a stunned kind of quiet, as if the world itself was catching its breath. Across the Western Front, soldiers stared at one another through wire and mud. Some cheered, some wept, some simply sat down where they stood. In London, Paris, and New York, bells rang and crowds filled the streets in a delirium of joy. But in towns that had changed hands a dozen times, in villages that no longer existed on a map, the silence felt uneasy. You do not turn off a storm and expect the air to be clear. The end of fighting did not mean the world snapped back into place. In the Central Powers, the armistice landed like an earthquake after a long tremor. Bulgaria had already peeled away. The Ottoman Empire was staggering. Austria-Hungary, stitched together by dynastic thread rather than shared nationhood, came apart along its seams. And Germany, the strongest pillar of the Central Powers, was cracking from within. Sailors mutinied, workers struck, soldiers voted with their feet. The Kaiser boarded a train into exile, and a republic was declared in a Berlin still echoing with street fighting. What collapsed in those weeks was more than military resistance. It was the old European order. Monarchs had ruled by habit and heritage. Empires had claimed destiny. Alliances had promised safety. The war had put all of it on trial and found much of it wanting. Even in the victorious countries, victory felt complicated. Nearly every family had an empty chair. Entire generations had learned to measure time by casualty lists and to speak softly about futures that might not arrive. When the armistice came, the Allies held the battlefield initiative, but the fighting had not run a neat course from aggression to justice. Mistakes were common, waste frequent, and in those final hours, men still died. Private Henry Gunther, an American, charged a German position and fell at 10:59 a.m., 1 minute before the ceasefire took effect. His death reminded many that war's logic obeys momentum more than mercy. In the East, the war had already shattered an empire and birthed a revolution. Russia's year of 1917 ended Romanov rule and installed Bolshevik power amid civil war and foreign intervention. As guns quieted in France and Belgium, fighting and famine still raged between the Baltic and the Caucasus. Borders that had been lines on a diplomat's map were becoming living wounds, contested by armies and partisans, by hunger and hope. The armistice created a problem of success. The Allies had to convert military victory into a durable peace, and do it while governing public grief and anger, repairing economies, and facing influenza that carried death into homes far from any trench. The temptation would be to treat peace like a verdict and not a negotiation, to assume the defeated could be compelled into stability. The danger, often forgotten in the elation of parades, was that punishment without reconciliation can be its own fuse. Yet there was a real appetite for something better. In speeches and editorials, people talked about a different kind of international system, open diplomacy instead of secret deals, reduced arms instead of stockpiles, national self-determination instead of imperial carve-ups. The words felt fresh and clean after years of mud and gas, and even skeptics wanted to believe that modernity might finally mean progress without slaughter. But ideals collide with interests, and interests were raw. France had watched battle roll across its fields and factories and counted its dead by the million. Britain wanted security at sea and stability on land, and the bills paid. Italy expected the territory it had been promised. The United States brought President Wilson's 14 points and the idea of a League of Nations, yet it would wrestle with its own isolationist mood. Meanwhile, Germany arrived not as an equal but as a defendant, its new republic expected to accept guilt for a catastrophe born of many hands and a long fuse. In the weeks after the armistice, trains carried men home who were no longer boys, and many discovered they didn't quite fit the houses they had left. Some carried scars, others, silence. Shell shock was a phrase that tried to capture a shattered nervous system with a tidy label. Women who had run farms and factories wondered why the confidence of wartime vanished so quickly in peacetime. Colonized soldiers and laborers who had served the empires began to ask what their sacrifice had purchased, if not a voice. So the silence of November 11th was not the end of the story, but the opening of a new chapter. The guns were quiet, but argument filled the vacuum. How to redraw the map, how to balance justice and mercy, how to treat enemies who were also future neighbors. The answers, improvised in conference rooms and corridor whispers, would shape a generation and, in time, light the path to a second and even wider war. Empires, unravel, mutiny, revolution, and the new map. The end of the First World War was not a clean break between past and future. It was a landslide, with entire empires tumbling down in fragments, leaving behind rubble that would take decades to settle. The armistice silenced the guns, but it did not silence the discontent that had been building beneath the surface of Europe's great dynasties. The war had strained their foundations, and once the fighting stopped, those foundations cracked wide open. Germany was the most visible collapse. For 4 years, its propaganda had promised victory, sacrifice, and honor. By late 1918, the reality was hunger, exhaustion, and despair. In naval ports like Kiel, sailors mutinied rather than throw themselves into a final suicidal battle. Workers in cities joined them, staging strikes and demonstrations. Councils, workers, and soldiers' committees sprang up in imitation of Russia's Soviets. The Kaiser, once the embodiment of German pride, fled into exile in the Netherlands, and a republic was declared. But Germany was not united in this new direction. Revolutionaries demanded a socialist order, while conservatives feared chaos and Bolshevism. Violence flickered through the streets, foreshadowing years of instability that extremists would later exploit. Austria-Hungary disintegrated even more dramatically. The empire had always been a patchwork quilt, stitched together by dynastic rule rather than shared identity. Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Poles, Ukrainians, and Italians had fought side by side under the Habsburg banner, but by 1918, few felt loyalty to Vienna. Nationalist leaders declared independence one after another. Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the state of Slovenes, Croats and Serbs, all claimed sovereignty before the armistice was even signed. What remained of Austria and Hungary were reduced to small landlocked states, shadows of the vast multi-ethnic empire that had once stretched across Central Europe. The Ottoman Empire, too, had been fatally weakened. Already branded the sick man of Europe before the war, it had fought alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary, and now faced the victor's knives. Its Arab provinces, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, were carved up into mandates, handed to Britain and France under the guise of preparing them for independence. In reality, they were colonies by another name. Istanbul itself remained Ottoman, but even here the empire's fate was sealed. Out of its ashes, through war and reform, a new Turkish republic would rise under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, determined to modernize and to push back against foreign domination. Russia's collapse had come earlier, but its reverberations continued to shake the continent. The Romanov dynasty had fallen in 1917, toppled by revolution after 3 centuries in power. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin, had seized control with promises of peace, land, and bread, but they inherited a nation already in turmoil. Civil war raged between Reds and Whites, while foreign armies intervened along Russia's edges, hoping to strangle communism in its cradle. By 1921, the Bolsheviks had triumphed, but at the cost of famine, repression, and millions of lives. The Soviet Union emerged, the world's first communist state, committed to overturning the old order that had dominated Europe for centuries. In Eastern Europe, new nations sprang up almost overnight. Poland reappeared on the map after more than a century of partition, its borders contested on every side. Finland declared independence from Russia. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, seized the chance to break free. Yugoslavia, a new kingdom uniting Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, was proclaimed. Each of these nations celebrated freedom, but their independence carried tensions: ethnic minorities, disputed frontiers, fragile institutions. What looked like liberation to some looked like fragmentation to others, and the seeds of future conflicts were already being planted. Even the victors were not untouched by the unraveling. Britain and France had emerged on the winning side, but they were exhausted and indebted. Their colonial empires seemed more expansive than ever, swollen with new territories taken from the Ottomans and Germans, yet maintaining them demanded resources neither power truly had. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, veterans and laborers who had fought and served in imperial armies began to ask pointed questions. If the war had been for freedom and self-determination, why did those principles not apply to colonized peoples? In India, Egypt, Korea, and beyond, nationalist movements gained momentum, inspired by both resentment and hope. The global map of 1919 looked dramatically different from that of 1914. 4 great empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, had collapsed, leaving behind a scatter of new states, fragile republics, and ambitious movements. The British and French empires looked larger, but were weaker, more vulnerable to the winds of change. The United States, meanwhile, had emerged as a creditor and industrial giant, still uncertain whether to entangle itself in European politics or retreat into its own sphere. It was a moment of possibility, but also of peril. The old order was gone, but the new order had not yet stabilized. National self-determination sounded noble, yet in practice it created contested borders and bitter minorities. Democracy appeared to advance, but many new governments lacked the traditions or the stability to sustain it. Communism loomed as both an inspiration and a threat, spreading fear among elites and hope among the desperate. In the silence after the guns, Europe was remade not by choice, but by collapse. Empires unraveled, monarchs fell, and new nations crowded onto the stage. The question that lingered was whether this new map could endure, or whether the fault lines left by war would rupture again. And in the gilded halls of Paris, where diplomats gathered to write the terms of peace, those fault lines were about to be etched into treaties that would shape the century. Versailles: peace, punishment, and unfinished business. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 was one of the most ambitious gatherings in history. Leaders from more than 30 nations converged on the French capital, determined to craft a settlement that would ensure the Great War had truly been the war to end all wars. Yet, from the very start, the conference was less about harmony and more about power. The grandeur of the Palace of Versailles, with its gilded mirrors and sweeping halls, masked deep divisions among the victors. At the center of it all were the so-called Big Four. Woodrow Wilson of the United States carried his famous 14 points, a blueprint for a new world order built on transparency, disarmament, and self-determination. He envisioned a League of Nations, a global body where disputes could be resolved without war. It was an idealist's dream, born from America's sense of moral mission. Standing beside him, France's Georges Clemenceau, nicknamed the Tiger, could not have been more different. France had suffered invasion, devastation, and the loss of over 1 million soldiers. Clemenceau's priority was security. He wanted Germany crippled so it could never threaten France again. Between them stood Britain's Prime Minister David Lloyd George, pragmatic and shrewd. He knew the British public wanted to punish Germany, but he also understood that a completely shattered Germany might destabilize Europe and wreck trade. He sought a balance between vengeance and practicality. The fourth man, Italy's Vittorio Orlando, hoped for territorial rewards promised when Italy joined the Allies, but found himself sidelined by the bigger powers. Germany, the nation whose fate was being decided, had no seat at the table. Its representatives were summoned only to receive the terms already written. For many Germans, this exclusion felt like humiliation piled upon defeat, a dictated peace rather than a negotiated settlement. The Treaty of Versailles, finalized in June 1919, was harsh and sweeping. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, declared Germany solely responsible for the war. On that foundation rested immense reparations, 132 billion gold marks, a sum so enormous it seemed impossible to pay. Beyond money, the treaty tore away land. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France, the Saar Basin was placed under League administration, and Poland was given access to the sea through the so-called Polish Corridor, slicing into German territory. The city of Danzig became a free city, further fueling resentment. Germany's overseas colonies were seized and parceled out as mandates to Britain, France, and others. The military restrictions were equally severe. The German army was capped at 100,000 men, conscription was banned, and the production of tanks, aircraft, and submarines was forbidden. The Rhineland, a crucial industrial region, was to be demilitarized, leaving Germany's western frontier vulnerable. For a nation that had prided itself on its martial tradition, this disarmament felt like a deliberate humiliation. To Clemenceau, the treaty was a safeguard. To Wilson, a compromise that allowed his League of Nations to be born. To Lloyd George, it was a balancing act. But to most Germans, it was a betrayal. Many insisted they had never truly been defeated in the field, pointing out that when the armistice was signed in November 1918, German troops still occupied foreign soil. This belief gave rise to the poisonous stab-in-the-back myth, the idea that Germany had been betrayed not by its generals, but by politicians, socialists, and Jews. Though false, it resonated deeply, seeding anger that extremists would later exploit. The treaty also created new tensions across Europe. Borders were redrawn in the name of self-determination, yet millions found themselves minorities in new states. Germans in Sudetenland now lived under Czechoslovak rule. Hungarians in Transylvania were part of Romania, and Poles, Ukrainians, and Lithuanians jostled over contested frontiers. The principle of national self-rule, celebrated in Wilson's rhetoric, was applied inconsistently, often bent to suit the strategic interests of the victors. Meanwhile, Wilson's cherished League of Nations was born, but its foundations were weak. Ironically, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, keeping America out of the League altogether. Without American power behind it, the organization struggled from the outset. Idealism faltered in the face of realpolitik. The reactions were mixed. In France, some believed the treaty had not gone far enough, fearing Germany might recover too quickly. In Britain, some worried the reparations were excessive and would cripple trade. In Germany, rage and humiliation dominated, uniting groups across the political spectrum in opposition to Versailles. What the treaty achieved was a pause, not a solution. It ended the fighting, reshaped the map, and created a framework for peace. But it also left bitterness, instability, and grievances that would fester. The war had destroyed the old order, and Versailles tried to build a new one, but it was a structure riddled with cracks. The guns of the Western Front had fallen silent, yet the echoes of Versailles carried forward. It was not only a treaty of peace, but also a treaty of unfinished business, and in those unfinished promises lay the foundations of another, even deadlier conflict to come. Reparations, hyperinflation, and the fragile Weimar Republic. Germany emerged from Versailles not just defeated, but burdened with a bill it could scarcely afford to pay. The reparations, fixed at 132 billion gold marks, were meant to compensate for the devastation wrought across Belgium, France, and beyond. Entire towns lay in ruins, farms were scarred by shell craters, and industries had been dismantled or destroyed. For France in particular, reparations seemed like justice, but for Germany, it was an impossible demand that sowed despair, rage, and desperation. In the early years, the Weimar Republic, the fragile democracy that replaced the Kaiser's empire, struggled to meet Allied expectations. Taxes were raised, resources redirected, and loans taken, but the German economy had already been gutted by wartime blockade and dislocation. Every payment sent abroad felt like salt rubbed into a wound, a visible symbol of national humiliation. Politicians who signed the treaty were branded November criminals, accused of betraying the fatherland. When Germany inevitably fell behind on payments, the Allies pressed harder. In 1921, the Reparations Commission demanded a massive annual schedule of payments, ignoring German pleas for leniency. By 1923, France and Belgium lost patience. Claiming Germany had deliberately defaulted, they sent troops to occupy the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. Mines, railways, and factories were seized. The German response was passive resistance. Workers went on strike, industries ground to a halt, and the government continued paying wages by printing more money. What followed was one of the most infamous economic collapses in modern history: hyperinflation. Prices began to double by the week, then by the day, and finally by the hour. Ordinary Germans saw their savings vanish overnight. Bank accounts that once represented decades of hard work became worthless. People pushed wheelbarrows of paper notes to buy a loaf of bread. Children played with stacks of currency as if they were building blocks. Workers were sometimes paid twice a day so they could rush to spend their wages before they lost value. Pensioners on fixed incomes, once secure, were reduced to begging. Hyperinflation did not just destroy wealth, it destroyed trust. Faith in the Weimar government evaporated. Many ordinary citizens believed democracy itself had failed them. For extremists, the chaos was a gift. Communists argued capitalism had collapsed, while far-right nationalists insisted only a return to strength and order could save Germany. Amid this turmoil, a little-known political agitator named Adolf Hitler attempted his first coup in Munich in 1923. Though the beer hall putsch failed, The mood of despair gave him his first taste of the spotlight. International pressure eventually forced a temporary solution. In 1924, the Dawes Plan, largely driven by American financiers, restructured Germany's payments. Loans from U.S. banks helped stabilize the currency, and the new Reichsmark replaced the worthless Papiermark. For a few years, a fragile prosperity returned. Berlin cafes buzzed with life, cultural creativity flourished, and the Republic appeared to steady itself. Yet beneath the surface, the system remained brittle, dependent on foreign credit and vulnerable to shocks. The psychological scars of hyperinflation never healed. Germans who had lost their savings carried the memory like an open wound. Even as stability returned, many mistrusted banks, politicians, and the very idea of compromise. Resentment toward Versailles simmered, waiting for someone to exploit it. Meanwhile, reparations remained a constant flashpoint. Every installment reminded Germans of subjugation, every delay prompted Allied threats, and every attempt at negotiation fueled political infighting at home. The Republic seemed caught in a trap. If it paid, it angered its citizens. If it refused, it invited foreign occupation. For the Allies, the story was just as complicated. France clung to reparations as the means to rebuild devastated provinces. Britain, more concerned with trade, quietly doubted the wisdom of bankrupting a future partner. The United States, though the source of loans that kept the system afloat, withdrew into isolationism, leaving Europe to wrestle with its own contradictions. The hyperinflation crisis of 1923 was more than an economic disaster. It was a turning point in German memory, proof to many that Versailles had poisoned their future. The Weimar Republic survived, for the moment, but it staggered into the late 1920s deeply weakened. The illusion of stability masked a society still fractured, suspicious, and vulnerable. And when the next great shock came, that illusion would shatter, plunging Germany and the world toward an even darker chapter. The lost generation and the cultural shifts. After the war. World War I was not just fought in trenches and fields, it was fought in the hearts and minds of an entire generation. Those who survived often described themselves as lost, a word that captured both their disillusionment and their search for meaning in a world torn apart. The term lost generation was popularized by writer Gertrude Stein and immortalized by Ernest Hemingway. It referred to the young men and women whose formative years were consumed by war and who returned to a society that no longer seemed to fit. Before 1914, Europe had lived in a confident age of optimism, progress, and stability. By 1918, that confidence was shattered. For millions of soldiers, coming home did not mean peace. It meant carrying invisible scars. The horrors of trench warfare, endless bombardments, poison gas, the cries of the wounded, stayed with them long after the armistice. Many suffered from what was then called shell shock, symptoms we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares, tremors, and sudden fits of panic were common. Society, however, was ill-equipped to understand. Instead of compassion, many veterans were met with suspicion, dismissal, or even shame. The visible scars were no less haunting. Streets across Europe filled with men on crutches, with empty sleeves pinned neatly to uniforms, with faces rebuilt by crude surgery. The sheer scale of loss was staggering. Entire towns had lost most of their young men, and women found themselves widowed before their 20s. An entire demographic gap marked the post-war generation, with consequences that rippled for decades. Yet the war also opened doors that had long been closed. With millions of men away at the front, women stepped into roles previously denied them. They worked in munitions factories, drove buses, staffed offices, and tilled fields. For many, the war proved that they could handle the responsibilities of men, and afterward, they demanded recognition. In countries like Britain, Germany, and the United States, women gained the right to vote in the years immediately following the war. The suffrage victories were both a political milestone and a cultural earthquake. Cultural expression mirrored this upheaval. The arts became a canvas for grief, rebellion, and experimentation. Writers like Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Eric Maria Remarque captured the aimlessness and trauma of their generation. Remarque's novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, became a landmark, stripping away any last illusions of war as noble or romantic. In poetry, Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon painted searing pictures of mud, blood, and futility. Their verses stood in stark contrast to the patriotic odes that had once filled newspapers. Art itself fractured. The old traditions seemed bankrupt in the face of the war's absurd destruction. Movements like Dadaism, born in Zurich in 1916, embraced chaos and nonsense as a reaction to a world that no longer made sense. Surrealism soon followed, exploring dreams and the subconscious as an escape from grim reality. These artistic revolutions rejected certainty, reflecting a broader distrust of authority, nationalism, and tradition. Music and entertainment also shifted. The 1920s became the Jazz Age, a period of improvisation, energy, and defiance. In smoke-filled clubs from Paris to New York, jazz became the soundtrack of a generation determined to live in the moment. Dancing, drinking, and new fashions, flapper dresses, short hair, modernist suits, signaled a cultural rebellion. For some, it was escapism. For others, a declaration that life, fragile as it was, must be celebrated. Religion, too, faced challenges. Many struggled to reconcile faith with the carnage they had witnessed. Some abandoned traditional beliefs, while others turned to new philosophies, psychology, or political ideologies for answers. The war had shaken not just nations, but worldviews. This cultural shift was not uniform. In some rural and conservative communities, tradition held fast, and the disillusionment of urban intellectuals seemed alien. But the influence of the lost generation spread nonetheless, shaping literature, art, politics, and identity far beyond Europe. Even in the United States, which had experienced the war for a shorter time, the cultural aftershocks were powerful, redefining what it meant to be young, modern, and free. The post-war era was, in many ways, a paradox. It was a time of mourning and trauma, but also of liberation and creativity. Out of the war's ashes came both despair and reinvention. The lost were not just broken. They were pioneers of a new cultural landscape, one that redefined modernity. But the same social changes that sparked creativity also unsettled old orders. Traditional elites feared that society was unraveling. Nationalists worried that values of discipline and sacrifice were being replaced by decadence. And amid the vibrant chaos of the 1920s, darker movements were already stirring, promising a return to order, certainty, and strength. The war had unleashed change that could not be undone. The question was how that change would shape the stormy decades to come. Redrawing borders and the birth of new nations. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, Europe's political map lay in ruins. The great empires that had dominated for centuries, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the German, and even the Russian, had collapsed or were collapsing. What emerged in their place was not stability, but a fragile experiment, a continent redrawn by treaties, nationalism, and improvisation. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, once a sprawling mosaic of peoples and languages, disintegrated almost overnight. Its vast territories were divided into new states like Czechoslovakia and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later called Yugoslavia. Austria and Hungary themselves were stripped down to modest republics, their imperial ambitions gone. But the new borders often ignored ethnic realities. Germans in the Sudetenland found themselves under Czech rule, while Croats and Serbs bristled within their shared kingdom. These tensions would simmer for decades, planting seeds of future conflict. Poland, long carved up by its neighbors, re-emerged as an independent state after more than a century of absence. For Poles, independence was a dream fulfilled, yet it came at a cost. Securing its borders meant wars with Soviet Russia and disputes with Germany. The port city of Danzig became a free city under the League of Nations, meant to avoid conflict, but instead becoming a flashpoint. Poland stood proud but vulnerable, caught between powerful and resentful neighbors. The collapse of the Russian Empire created new opportunities and new dangers. Amid the chaos of revolution and civil war, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania declared independence. For the Baltic peoples, freedom was exhilarating, but it came with constant fear. Soviet Russia regarded them as wayward provinces, while Germany and Poland eyed them as buffers or prizes. Their sovereignty was real but fragile, precariously balanced between greater powers. Germany itself was transformed. The Treaty of Versailles stripped it of Alsace-Lorraine, returned to France after nearly 50 years. Land was ceded to Belgium, Denmark, and the New Poland. The Rhineland was demilitarized, a humiliation meant to keep German troops away from France's borders. Overseas colonies, once symbols of pride, were confiscated and redistributed among the Allies as mandates. To many Germans, this felt like mutilation, a dictated peace that carved away not only territory, but dignity. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire collapsed under the weight of defeat and internal revolt. Its Arab lands were divided between Britain and France under the system of mandates. Britain took control of Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq, while France claimed Syria and Lebanon. On paper, these were territories being prepared for independence. In practice, they were colonial possessions in all but name. Promises made to Arab leaders during the war were broken, fueling resentment that would echo through the century. The creation of Palestine as a British mandate was particularly complex. Britain had already issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, supporting a national home for the Jewish people. Jewish immigration to Palestine increased, while Arab inhabitants grew fearful of displacement. What began as a diplomatic promise would grow into one of the world's most enduring conflicts. Not all changes came from treaties alone. Some were born of revolutionary fervor. In Ireland, long under British rule, the war accelerated demands for independence. The Easter Rising of 1916 had already shaken Dublin, and by 1919, the Irish War of Independence erupted. While not directly a product of the Versailles map, it reflected the same powerful currents of nationalism unleashed by the war. The League of Nations, founded in 1920, was supposed to oversee these new borders and ensure peace. It represented an ambitious attempt at collective security, inspired by Woodrow Wilson's idealism. But the League lacked real enforcement power. The United States, ironically, never joined, weakening its credibility from the start. And for those trapped in minority enclaves within new states, the League's promises of protection often rang hollow. The redrawing of borders was, in many ways, a compromise between lofty ideals and raw power. The principle of self-determination, so often invoked, was applied selectively. Some peoples were granted independence, while others were denied. The victors justified the changes as necessary for stability, but the patchwork they created was riddled with fault lines. Ordinary people felt the consequences most directly. A farmer in Transylvania might go to bed an Austrian subject and wake up under Romanian rule. A shopkeeper in Alsace might be ordered to switch from German to French. These changes were not abstract lines on a map. They were lived realities of identity, language, and loyalty. For many, they brought confusion and resentment, emotions that extremists would later exploit. The new Europe of the 1920s was smaller in empires, but larger in uncertainties. New nations celebrated their independence with pride, but the balance was delicate. Old grudges lingered, minority rights were fragile, and the very borders meant to secure peace often guaranteed tension. The First World War had not just killed millions, it had dismantled the old order. What replaced it was a Europe and a Middle East full of new beginnings, but also new fault lines that would prove all too explosive. Reparations and the economic fallout of the war. The Treaty of Versailles did not only redraw maps, it also placed a crushing financial burden on Germany. The Allies demanded reparations, massive payments meant to compensate for the devastation of the war. For the French, whose countryside had been turned into a wasteland of shell craters and ruins, this felt like justice. For the British, weighed down by war debts, it seemed necessary. But for Germany, it was humiliation and hardship on a scale that few could have imagined. The infamous War Guilt Clause, Article 231 of the treaty, laid sole responsibility for the war on Germany and its allies. This single sentence became the legal basis for reparations. The sum eventually fixed was staggering: 132 billion gold marks, the equivalent of roughly $33 billion at the time. To put it in perspective, this was several times Germany's entire annual national income. Even to the victors, it was obvious that such a figure could never truly be paid. But the demand was symbolic as much as financial. It was a statement of guilt, punishment, and control. For ordinary Germans, the effects were immediate. The war had already strained the economy, the naval blockade had caused shortages, and the return to peacetime disrupted industries. Now, on top of this, the government faced impossible payments. To cope, it raised taxes and began printing more money. At first, this seemed manageable, but by 1921, the economy was sliding into chaos. The breaking point came in 1923. When Germany fell behind on its payments, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. The German government urged workers there to go on strike, refusing to produce coal or steel for the occupiers. The workers complied, but the government still had to pay them. With no tax revenue, Berlin turned on the printing presses. The result was one of the most infamous cases of hyperinflation in history. Within months, the German mark collapsed. A loaf of bread that had cost 1 mark before the war now cost millions. Housewives carried banknotes in baskets and wheelbarrows, only to find them worthless by evening. Pensioners who had saved diligently all their lives watched their life savings vanish overnight. Children played with stacks of banknotes as if they were building blocks. It was a surreal and humiliating collapse of trust in money itself. Hyperinflation tore apart the social fabric. The middle class, once the backbone of stability, was ruined. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day before prices rose again. Farmers, who could barter food, fared slightly better, but urban families starved. Crime increased, and extremist movements gained traction by exploiting anger and despair. Many Germans blamed not just the Allies, but their own leaders, accusing them of betrayal and weakness. The phrase, "stab in the back," gained momentum, a myth that the German army had not been defeated in the field, but betrayed by politicians, communists, and Jews at home. To stabilize the crisis, international intervention became necessary. In 1924, the Dawes Plan, backed by American loans, helped restructure payments and restore some order. New currency, the Rentenmark, replaced the worthless paper marks, and for a few years, Germany entered a period of relative stability. Cities like Berlin even became vibrant centers of art, music, and nightlife during the Golden Twenties. But this stability was fragile, built on foreign credit and unresolved resentment. Reparations also strained the Allies themselves. Britain and France had borrowed heavily from the United States during the war and needed German payments to repay their debts. Yet the more they squeezed Germany, the more unstable Europe became. It was a vicious circle. Germany paid reparations with money borrowed from American banks, which France and Britain used to repay America. When the U.S. economy faltered in the late 1920s, the whole system collapsed like a house of cards. The Great Depression of 1929 struck Germany harder than almost any other nation. American loans dried up, factories closed, and unemployment soared. By 1932, over 6 million Germans, nearly a third of the workforce, were out of jobs. Bread lines stretched through cities. Political extremism surged as desperate citizens looked for answers. The Nazi Party, once a fringe group, suddenly found its message resonating with millions. The reparations issue revealed a painful truth. Peace built on punishment was fragile. Instead of reconciliation, Versailles left bitterness and anger. Instead of rebuilding Europe together, it deepened divisions. France sought security by weakening Germany, but in doing so created the very instability that would lead to renewed conflict. Britain grew uneasy, recognizing that an economically strangled Germany was dangerous. The United States, though initially invested in stabilizing Europe, retreated into isolation once its own economy collapsed. For Germany, reparations became more than an economic challenge. They became a symbol of national humiliation, a wound that never healed. Every payment, every foreign demand, every lost factory or farm reinforced the idea that Germany had been unfairly shackled. Politicians who promised to tear up Versailles and restore pride found eager audiences. Thus, the economic fallout of reparations was not just about numbers. It was about dignity, memory, and anger. The hyperinflation of 1923 scarred a generation. The Depression of the 1930s fueled radicalism. And the sense of betrayal embedded in Article 231 became a rallying cry for those who would plunge Europe into war once again. The attempt to make Germany pay for the war had, in effect, ensured that peace would not last. What began as financial punishment had spiraled into social collapse, political extremism, and ultimately, the rise of Hitler. The story of reparations was not merely about money. It was about the dangerous power of resentment, the lost generation, and the social aftermath of war. World War I did not end for millions of people when the armistice was signed. The scars ran deeper than ruined cities or shattered economies. They were carved into the minds and lives of those who had endured 4 years of unprecedented violence. The phrase that came to define this period was the lost generation, a term popularized by writer Gertrude Stein and later echoed by Ernest Hemingway to describe the disillusioned young men and women who had lived through the war but struggled to find meaning afterward. For the soldiers who survived the trenches, reintegration into civilian life was rarely smooth. They had seen horrors unimaginable to those back home: mud-filled dugouts, relentless artillery bombardments, poison gas, and the endless sight of friends cut down beside them. When they returned to their towns and villages, they often felt alien, unable to share experiences with those who could never understand. Many carried physical wounds, but even more bore invisible ones. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder was then known as shell shock. At the time, it was poorly understood and often treated as weakness or cowardice. Men who had braved the slaughter at the Somme or Verdun could be dismissed as malingerers if they trembled at loud noises or broke down in tears. The trauma was not confined to the battlefield. Families had been torn apart. Millions of widows and orphans were left to rebuild their lives without fathers, husbands, or sons. Entire communities mourned generations of young men lost to war. In small villages across Europe, memorials sprang up bearing long lists of names, sometimes dozens from the same community. In France, Britain, Germany, and beyond, there were towns where nearly every family carried grief. Women, too, emerged from the war changed forever. With millions of men at the front, women had taken on roles once reserved for men, working in factories, driving trams, serving as nurses, or managing farms. They had proved their capability in fields from heavy industry to medicine. When the war ended, many were expected to return quietly to domestic life. But the genie was out of the bottle. Their wartime contributions strengthened demands for political rights. In country after country, women gained the vote in the years that followed. Britain in 1918, Germany the same year, the United States in 1920. The war had cracked open doors that would never be shut again. Culturally, the war sparked a profound crisis of faith in old values. Before 1914, Europe had believed in progress, reason, and the steady march of civilization. The war shattered those illusions. How could anyone speak of progress when machine guns mowed down thousands in minutes? How could reason explain the slaughter of entire generations? The sense of betrayal ran deep. Governments had promised glory, honor, and swift victory, but delivered only mud, blood, and disillusionment. Artists, writers, and musicians gave voice to this discontent. The poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon rejected romantic notions of battle, instead portraying gas attacks, corpses, and the waste of young lives. In prose, Hemingway, Erich Maria Remarque, and others depicted veterans wandering through life with a hollowness that resonated far beyond their generation. In art, movements like Dadaism and Surrealism reflected the chaos and absurdity of the age, mocking the logic that had led to such carnage. Even jazz, which flourished in the 1920s, carried with it a restless energy, a break from the past, a refusal to conform to the old order. The war also altered demographics in profound ways. Millions of young men were dead, leaving a gender imbalance in many countries. In France, the term generation of widows became tragically common. Birth rates dropped sharply, and the absence of so many fathers shaped family life for decades. In Germany and Austria, impoverished veterans filled city streets, sometimes begging, sometimes seething with anger at governments that seemed to have abandoned them. This discontent fueled radical politics, whether communist movements promising revolution or far-right groups vowing revenge. Religious faith, too, was shaken. Many believers struggled to reconcile a just God with the senseless slaughter of millions. Some turned away from organized religion altogether. Others sought new spiritual paths or reinterpreted their faith in light of tragedy. The questioning of morality, purpose, and human nature became central themes in philosophy and culture. In the United States, which had entered the war later and suffered fewer casualties, the psychological shock was less severe but still significant. Returning veterans struggled to explain their experiences, and many turned to literature, creating works that defined American modernism. The Roaring Twenties, with its flappers, speakeasies, and jazz, can be seen as both a celebration of survival and an attempt to drown out the trauma that lingered beneath the surface. What united all of this was a pervasive sense of disorientation. The old world had collapsed, and the new one felt uncertain. The lost generation drifted between cynicism and creativity, between despair and innovation. Out of their alienation came some of the most powerful cultural works of the 20th century, but also a warning. When a generation loses faith in institutions, traditions, and truth itself, society becomes vulnerable to extremism. The war had ended, but for millions, peace felt hollow. The disillusionment of the lost generation was not merely a cultural mood. It was a lived reality, born from trenches, shell bursts, and empty chairs at dinner tables. And it was this fractured society that would struggle to confront the turbulent years ahead. New nations and borders, redrawing the map. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, the political map of Europe and the Middle East lay in ruins. The collapse of four great empires, the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, German, and Russian, left vast territories suddenly without masters. What followed was not merely a peace settlement, but a complete reordering of nations, borders, and identities. The old order of dynasties and empires gave way to an age of nation-states, though the process was anything but smooth. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, a patchwork of ethnic groups held together by loyalty to the Habsburg monarchy, disintegrated almost overnight. Czechs and Slovaks declared the creation of Czechoslovakia, while Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes united to form what would later be known as Yugoslavia. Hungary split from Austria, and both emerged as much smaller, weaker states. Each of these new nations carried within them diverse populations who did not always see themselves as part of the same political project. Tensions simmered as minorities, Germans in Czechoslovakia, Croats in Yugoslavia, Hungarians stranded outside their homeland, struggled with their new realities. Poland, erased from the map for over a century after being partitioned by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, re-emerged as an independent state. But its borders were contested from the start. Poles fought wars with Soviet Russia, Ukraine, and even Germany to carve out a state that was viable. The city of Danzig, modern-day Gdansk, became a free city under the League of Nations to avoid direct conflict between Poland and Germany, but it would remain a point of contention for decades. In the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania seized the opportunity to declare independence as the Russian Empire fell into revolution and civil war. Their independence was fragile, precariously balanced between the ambitions of Soviet Russia and the waning influence of Germany. Finland, too, broke away from Russia in 1917 and fought a brutal civil war between Reds and Whites before establishing itself as a republic. The Ottoman Empire, which had once stretched across 3 continents, also collapsed in the war's aftermath. The Turkish heartland around Anatolia remained, but vast territories in the Middle East were divided by the victors. Britain took control of Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq under League of Nations mandates, while France gained Syria and Lebanon. These new colonial arrangements ignored the complex ethnic and religious realities of the region. Promises made to Arab leaders during the war about independence were largely broken, sowing seeds of distrust and resentment that would echo for generations. In Palestine, Britain faced a unique dilemma. The 1917 Balfour Declaration had pledged support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people, even as the land was inhabited primarily by Arabs. This contradiction laid the foundations of a conflict that continues to shape global politics today. In Iraq and Syria, artificial borders grouped together diverse communities, Sunni and Shia Muslims, Kurds, Christians, and others, under governments that struggled to maintain legitimacy. Meanwhile, in Central Europe, Germany was stripped of territories as punishment under the Treaty of Versailles. Alsace and Lorraine were returned to France, while parts of eastern Germany were ceded to Poland. The Rhineland was demilitarized, creating a buffer between France and Germany, but also fueling German resentment. The loss of overseas colonies further humiliated the once mighty empire, and many Germans felt cheated, convinced they had been stabbed in the back rather than truly defeated. Russia, though technically one of the victors, was itself in chaos. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 had sparked a brutal civil war, leaving much of its former empire up for grabs. While the new Soviet Union eventually reasserted control over much of the former Russian territory, it lost Finland, the Baltic states, and Poland. The Bolsheviks' promise of global revolution alarmed Western powers, who saw the spread of communism as a new existential threat. This great reshuffling of borders was justified under the principle of self-determination, a phrase popularized by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. Yet the reality was far messier. In many cases, new borders were drawn not according to the wishes of local people, but to satisfy strategic or economic interests of the victors. Ethnic minorities often found themselves on the wrong side of new frontiers, creating tensions that would erupt later. The League of Nations, established to safeguard peace, was tasked with overseeing some of these new arrangements. But without the full support of powerful states like the United States, its ability to enforce stability was limited. The ambitious experiment of reshaping the world order was already showing cracks. For millions of ordinary people, the redrawing of the map meant dislocation and uncertainty. Refugees fled across borders that no longer matched their communities. Farmers woke up to find their village suddenly part of a different country. Nationalist movements celebrated independence, but quickly faced the challenges of governance, economic hardship, and political strife. The collapse of empires had ended one chapter of history, but the nations that rose from their ashes were fragile. Instead of guaranteeing lasting peace, the reshaped borders often planted new conflicts. The legacy of those post-war decisions would echo through the decades, feeding grievances that would eventually explode in another world war. Seeds of future conflict. How the Great War led to World War II. The First World War was called the War to End All Wars, but within just 2 decades, the world was engulfed in an even deadlier conflict. Far from securing a lasting peace, the aftermath of the Great War created a fragile and unstable international order. Harsh treaties, economic collapse, wounded national pride, and unresolved political tensions all combined to plant the seeds of another global war. To understand why World War II broke out, one must look closely at the failures and consequences of 1919. The Treaty of Versailles was at the heart of this fragile peace. Germany, forced to accept full responsibility for the war, faced crushing reparations and territorial losses. Its army was reduced to 100,000 men, its navy stripped, and its air force banned. Colonies were seized, and the Rhineland was demilitarized. To many Germans, this treaty felt less like peace and more like humiliation. The infamous war guilt clause burned deeply in national memory, fueling resentment that politicians and extremists would later exploit. Though Germany's leaders signed the treaty, much of the population came to see it as a dictated peace, a betrayal that set the stage for revenge. This resentment quickly took political form. Many Germans embraced the stab-in-the-back myth, which claimed that their army had not truly been defeated, but betrayed by politicians, communists, and Jews at home. This narrative not only undermined faith in the new Weimar Republic, but also became a powerful propaganda tool for nationalist movements, most notably the Nazis. It was in the bitterness of defeat and humiliation that Adolf Hitler found fertile ground for his rise. Economic turmoil added fuel to this fire. Germany struggled to pay reparations, and when it defaulted, France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr Valley in 1923. The German government responded by printing money, unleashing hyperinflation so severe that life savings evaporated overnight. Wheelbarrows of banknotes could not buy a loaf of bread. The crisis destroyed public confidence in democratic leaders and left millions desperate for stability and strong leadership. Although a temporary recovery followed with American loans under the Dawes Plan, the stability was fragile. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, Germany was once again plunged into despair, paving the way for extremist parties to gain mass support. The economic hardships were not confined to Germany. The war had left Europe in massive debt, with Britain and France relying heavily on American loans. When Wall Street collapsed, the ripple effects spread worldwide. Unemployment soared, poverty deepened, and faith in liberal democracies weakened. People across Europe began to turn toward leaders who promised quick solutions, whether fascist dictators like Mussolini and Hitler or authoritarian movements elsewhere. At the same time, the new borders drawn after the war created tensions of their own. The Austro-Hungarian Empire's collapse left behind a patchwork of small, vulnerable states, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and others, that struggled to maintain unity. Poland, newly re-established, fought wars over its frontiers and carried the burden of hosting diverse ethnic groups within its borders. In the Balkans, long-standing rivalries persisted beneath the surface. These fragile states became easy targets for manipulation by stronger powers in the 1930s. Meanwhile, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire sowed lasting instability in the Middle East. Promises of Arab independence made during the war were broken as Britain and France carved the region into mandates. In Palestine, conflicting promises to Arabs and Jews set the stage for an ongoing conflict. Across Asia and Africa, colonial peoples who had contributed to the war effort found their hopes for independence ignored, fueling nationalist movements that would erupt later in the century. The failure of the League of Nations further undermined hopes for peace. Conceived as a body to resolve disputes and prevent war, it lacked authority and power. Crucially, the United States never joined, weakening its credibility from the outset. Without an enforcement mechanism, the League was unable to stop acts of aggression in the 1930s, such as Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and Italy's attack on Ethiopia in 1935. These failures signaled to ambitious leaders that international rules could be broken without consequence. Another consequence of the Great War was the spread of radical ideologies. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia had created the world's first communist state, and its message of global revolution alarmed governments across Europe. In response, right-wing movements gained momentum, promising to defend tradition, nationalism, and stability against the perceived threat of communism. Fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany drew strength from this polarization, turning politics into a battleground of extremes. Militarily, the war had also changed expectations. The stalemate of trench warfare had taught lessons about mechanized conflict, leading nations to develop tanks, planes, and new doctrines. Germany, restricted by Versailles, found ways to circumvent the treaty and secretly prepare for rearmament. Once Hitler rose to power, rearmament became open policy, cheered on by citizens who longed to restore national pride. The memory of 1918, defeat without invasion, made many Germans believe they could win a future war if led decisively. For Britain and France, the scars of the Great War created a dangerous reluctance. Haunted by the bloodshed of the trenches, many leaders and citizens embraced appeasement in the 1930s, desperate to avoid another conflict. They tolerated Hitler's early moves, reoccupying the Rhineland, annexing Austria, and demanding Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, believing that granting these concessions might preserve peace. In reality, this only emboldened Germany further. By the late 1930s, the chain of failures from the post-1919 settlement had come full circle. Germany, humiliated and economically broken after World War I, had rearmed under Hitler's leadership. Italy, resentful of its mutilated victory, pursued expansion in Africa and the Mediterranean. Japan, seeking resources, expanded aggressively in Asia. The institutions meant to prevent war, the League of Nations and collective security agreements, proved powerless. The world had been reshaped by the Great War, but in ways that ensured peace could not last. The seeds planted in the ashes of 1918 had grown into a new and deadlier storm. When German tanks rolled into Poland in September 1939, the world was once again at war, this time on a scale even greater than before. Remembering the war, memorials, and memory. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, the world was left with a staggering sense of loss. Entire landscapes had been scarred, millions of lives extinguished, and families torn apart. The question for nations and communities was not only how to rebuild, but also how to remember. Out of this grief arose a culture of memorials, ceremonies, and traditions designed to give meaning to sacrifice and ensure that the Great War was never forgotten. In Britain, remembrance took on both national and local forms. In every village and town, stone memorials were erected bearing the names of local men who had not returned. For many families, these lists were the only tangible reminder, as countless soldiers had no known grave. At the national level, the cenotaph in London became the focal point of commemoration. Originally constructed as a temporary structure for a victory parade in 1919, it proved so moving to the public that it was rebuilt in stone as a permanent shrine to the dead. Every year on Armistice Day, later called Remembrance Day, crowds would gather there to lay wreaths and observe 2 minutes of silence. France, which had borne some of the heaviest fighting, also invested deeply in remembrance. Vast cemeteries spread across the former battlefields, rows upon rows of white crosses stretching to the horizon. The Douaumont ossuary near Verdun became one of the most poignant symbols, containing the remains of over 130,000 unidentified French and German soldiers. For the French, remembrance was not just about mourning. It was also about resilience, a way to honor the endurance of the nation in the face of devastation. Germany faced a more complicated memory. Defeated, humiliated by Versailles, and politically divided, its memorials often carried a different tone. Many monuments were built locally, often emphasizing the heroism of soldiers rather than the futility of war. The concept of the stab in the back myth seeped into memorial culture, with some communities framing their fallen as martyrs betrayed by weak politicians at home. Unlike the victorious nations, Germany's memory of the war became a breeding ground for grievance, which would later be harnessed by nationalist movements. One of the most powerful universal symbols of remembrance to emerge from the war was the unknown soldier. France, Britain, and the United States each created a tomb dedicated to an unidentified serviceman, representing all those who had died without a name. For grieving families who had no grave to visit, these monuments provided a place to mourn. The tomb of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, and Arlington National Cemetery in Washington became sacred spaces visited by millions over the decades. The poppy also became a lasting symbol, inspired by the poem In Flanders Fields, written by Canadian doctor John McCrae. The red flowers that grew over the battlefields of Belgium came to represent both bloodshed and renewal. Veterans groups in Britain and the Commonwealth adopted the poppy as a fundraising emblem, and wearing it each November became a tradition still observed today. Commemoration was not limited to monuments and symbols. Literature and art also played a major role in shaping how the war was remembered. War poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon gave voice to the pain, futility, and horror of trench life, while writers such as Erich Maria Remarque in All Quiet on the Western Front portrayed the disillusionment of soldiers from the German perspective. These works challenged the romantic notions of glory in war, instead confronting readers with its brutal reality. Painters, too, such as Paul Nash and Otto Dix, created haunting images of shattered landscapes and scarred soldiers that left lasting impressions. In many countries, annual ceremonies became an important part of memory culture. The silence at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month was observed widely, offering a moment when people could collectively grieve. Across the Commonwealth, Armistice Day grew into Remembrance Sunday, and in the United States it evolved into Veterans Day. These rituals reinforced the idea that those who had died were not forgotten, and that their sacrifice carried lessons for the living. Yet, memory was not uniform. In Russia, for example, the memory of World War I was overshadowed by the revolution and civil war that followed. The new Soviet government downplayed the war, focusing instead on the narrative of class struggle and the birth of a socialist state. In Eastern Europe, where new nations had been created from the ruins of empires, remembrance often intertwined with celebrations of independence and national rebirth. As the decades passed, the memory of the Great War shifted. By the 1930s, with the rise of new conflicts, some began to question whether the sacrifices had truly achieved the war to end all wars. Memorials became not only sites of mourning, but also stark reminders of political failure. When World War II erupted, many remembered the broken promises of 1919 and the cost of misplaced hopes for peace. And yet, despite the disillusionment, the memorials and traditions endured. They gave form to grief, connected generations, and ensured that the soldiers who had marched into the mud and blood of the trenches were not lost to silence. Memory kept their lives from being reduced to statistics. It turned personal loss into a collective narrative, one that still resonates more than a century later. The remembrance of the Great War was thus both a warning and a hope. A warning of the terrible price of conflict, but also a hope that by remembering, nations might learn to avoid repeating the same mistakes. Whether through stone monuments, scarlet poppies, or solemn silences, the world found ways to carry forward the memory of a war that had changed everything. The lasting legacy of the Great War. The Great War, as it was known before the Second Global Conflict, was more than a clash of armies. It was a rupture in human history, a turning point that reshaped politics, societies, economies, and cultures across the globe. Its legacy is not confined to the years immediately following 1918. It echoes through the entire 20th century and beyond. Understanding this legacy means seeing how the war's effects reached far beyond the trenches of Flanders and the fields of Verdun, influencing how the modern world was built. One of the clearest legacies was the collapse of empires. The Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, German, and Russian empires, which had dominated Europe and parts of Asia for centuries, disintegrated under the weight of war. Their fall unleashed a wave of self-determination, but also instability. Out of their ruins came new states like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Poland, each grappling with ethnic divisions and contested borders. In the Middle East, Ottoman lands were carved into mandates governed by Britain and France, decisions that planted seeds of future conflict. These geopolitical shifts were not temporary. They permanently altered the balance of global power and the political map we recognize today. Politically, the war also accelerated the decline of monarchies and the rise of new ideologies. The Russian Revolution of 1917 birthed the Soviet Union, the first communist state, offering an alternative model to capitalism and liberal democracy. In Germany, the Kaiser's abdication ushered in the Weimar Republic, an experiment in democracy that would struggle under economic strain and political extremism. Across Europe, socialism gained strength as workers demanded rights after years of sacrifice, while in Italy, the frustrations of veterans and economic turmoil gave rise to Benito Mussolini's fascist regime. The war, in short, created fertile ground for ideologies that would dominate the 20th century. Socially, the war transformed daily life. The enormous mobilization of men meant that women took on new roles in factories, offices, and farms, proving their capabilities in industries once reserved for men. This shift fueled the movement for women's suffrage. In countries like Britain, the United States, and Germany, women gained the right to vote in the years immediately following the war, a profound step toward gender equality. The war also broke down old class barriers. Soldiers from all walks of life fought side by side, and returning veterans carried with them a demand for recognition and fair treatment, pressuring governments to expand social welfare systems. The war also left a deep cultural and psychological imprint. The lost generation of artists and writers expressed a profound sense of disillusionment. Ernest Hemingway, Erich Maria Remarque, and poets like Wilfred Owen captured the futility and trauma of trench warfare, rejecting the old romanticism of battle. Artistic movements such as Dadaism and Surrealism reflected a world that had lost faith in reason and tradition. Even philosophy was shaped as thinkers questioned whether human progress was truly inevitable. The cultural legacy of the war was thus one of skepticism, cynicism, but also creativity as people searched for meaning in a shattered world. Economically, the Great War left scars that would shape the global system for decades. The cost of fighting pushed nations into unprecedented debt. Britain and France owed billions to the United States, while Germany faced crushing reparations under the Treaty of Versailles. Inflation destabilized currencies, and in Germany, hyperinflation of the early 1920s destroyed savings and trust in the state. Meanwhile, the United States emerged as the world's leading creditor and economic power, a shift that marked the beginning of America's dominance in global affairs. The financial instability created by the war made the global economy fragile, setting the stage for the Great Depression of the 1930s. Another legacy was technological. The war had spurred rapid advances in weaponry, medicine, and industry. Tanks, aircraft and chemical weapons had transformed the battlefield, while new surgical techniques and the wider use of blood transfusions saved countless lives. Many of these innovations carried over into civilian life, shaping medicine, transportation, and industry in the interwar years. The war had shown that science and industry could be harnessed for destruction on a massive scale, but also for progress. Perhaps the most haunting legacy was the realization that total war touched everyone. Civilians were not spared. Blockades caused famine, cities were shelled, and millions were displaced. Governments learned how to mobilize entire societies, using propaganda to shape opinion and rationing to manage scarce resources. This model of the total war state would be repeated and intensified in World War II. The Great War thus taught the world not only about the horrors of mechanized combat, but also about the capacity of modern states to control and direct their populations in times of crisis. Finally, the war left a moral and political lesson. The fragile peace that followed showed how unresolved grievances can fester. The punitive terms imposed on Germany, the neglect of colonial soldiers' sacrifices, and the uneven economic recovery all contributed to instability. The dream of a lasting peace, embodied in the League of Nations, failed because it lacked both American participation and the enforcement power to stop aggression. The war's greatest legacy may be this warning that peace cannot rest only on treaties, but must be built on justice, cooperation, and reconciliation. In the end, the Great War was not just the end of an old order. It was the beginning of a new world. Its legacies, political upheaval, cultural transformation, economic shifts, and the memory of mass sacrifice, shaped the century that followed. To understand the modern world, one must begin with 1914 to 1918, because in those years, the foundation of the 20th century was laid in blood, in hope, and in grief. Lessons and warnings for the future. The Great War was often described in its aftermath as the war to end all wars. Yet within a generation, the world was engulfed in an even more devastating conflict. Why did this hope collapse so quickly? The answer lies in the many lessons and warnings the First World War offered. Some recognized at the time, others ignored. These lessons are crucial, not only for understanding the road to World War II, but for recognizing the patterns of conflict that still echo today. One of the clearest warnings was that peace built on punishment rather than reconciliation cannot endure. The Treaty of Versailles, while hailed as a victory by the Allies, placed enormous burdens on Germany. The war guilt clause forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the conflict, while reparations crippled its economy. For ordinary Germans, the treaty felt like humiliation, a dictated peace imposed without negotiation. This sense of injustice became fertile ground for extremist ideologies, particularly the rise of Nazism. The warning is timeless. When peace settlements seek vengeance rather than balance, they often plant the seeds of the next conflict. Another lesson was about the fragility of international cooperation. The League of Nations, born from President Woodrow Wilson's vision of collective security, was a bold attempt to prevent future wars, but it lacked real enforcement power, and crucially, the United States, the very architect of the League, never joined. Without the support of major powers, and without mechanisms to compel aggressors to stop, the League failed to prevent Japanese expansion in Asia, Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, and ultimately Hitler's aggression in Europe. The warning here is clear. International organizations can only succeed if they are backed by commitment, resources, and the will to act. The war also revealed the dangers of unchecked nationalism. Before 1914, nationalist fervor had fueled imperial ambitions and ethnic rivalries. During the war, propaganda painted enemies as subhuman, making compromise impossible. After the war, nationalism resurfaced in new forms. Hungarians, Poles, Czechs, Serbs, and many others pursued independence, often at the expense of minority populations within their borders. At the same time, German nationalism turned inward, channeling humiliation into a toxic desire for revenge. The lesson is stark. Nationalism can unite a people, but when twisted into superiority and exclusion, it becomes a destabilizing force that pushes nations toward conflict. A further warning came from the war's economic legacy. The collapse of trade during the war, followed by the uneven recovery in the 1920s, left many countries vulnerable. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, it devastated economies already strained by debt and reparations. In Germany, mass unemployment and hyperinflation eroded trust in democracy and fueled support for radical movements. The lesson is simple but often overlooked. Economic stability is a cornerstone of peace. Without jobs, security, and prosperity, people are more likely to turn to leaders who promise salvation through authoritarianism and aggression. The war also demonstrated the profound psychological toll of modern conflict. Millions of soldiers returned home scarred not only physically, but mentally. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, left many veterans unable to reintegrate into society. In countries like Britain and France, war memorials honored the fallen, but veterans often felt abandoned, struggling with unemployment and trauma. This alienation fed disillusionment and cynicism in entire societies. The warning here is that the human cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield. If ignored, it can corrode the very foundations of peace. Equally important was the lesson of rapid technological change. The Great War introduced tanks, machine guns, poison gas, and aircraft in ways that revolutionized combat. The conflict showed that technology could give one side temporary advantages, but it also escalated the scale of destruction. By the 1930s, many leaders believed that new weapons like bombers or chemical arms could deliver swift, decisive victories. They forgot that technology cannot substitute for strategy or diplomacy. It only raises the stakes. The warning is that advances in weaponry must be balanced by equally strong efforts in diplomacy and restraint. Perhaps the most haunting lesson was that wars, once begun, are far easier to start than to end. In 1914, many leaders believed the fighting would be short. 4 years later, with millions dead, the war ground to a close only because societies had reached breaking point. The difficulty of ending the conflict showed how entangling alliances, pride, and sunk costs can trap nations in cycles of destruction. The warning is enduring. Leaders should be cautious before unleashing war, for once the machinery is set in motion, stopping it is far harder than imagined. The legacy of the Great War thus offers a mirror. It reminds us of the price of arrogance, the dangers of humiliation, and the fragility of peace. Its warnings were often ignored in the 1920s and 1930s, with catastrophic consequences. Yet for later generations, the lessons remained. After World War II, leaders sought to avoid repeating Versailles with the Marshall Plan, which emphasized reconstruction rather than punishment. The United Nations, though imperfect, was created with more authority than the League. And European integration, beginning with economic cooperation, was designed to make future wars between France and Germany unthinkable. The Great War's ultimate lesson is that peace is not self-sustaining. It must be built, nurtured, and protected through justice, economic stability, international cooperation, and respect for human dignity. When these pillars are ignored, history shows us that conflict is never far behind. The human cost and the memory of war. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, the relief was immense. But the silence did not erase the scars. The First World War left behind a legacy of loss and grief on a scale that the world had never experienced before. More than 16 million people had died, soldiers and civilians alike, and many millions more were wounded, displaced, or traumatized. Behind every statistic were families broken, communities hollowed, and futures altered forever. For the soldiers who fought, the experience was searing. Those who returned often carried visible wounds, amputations from shell explosions, burns from flamethrowers, and blindness from poison gas. Medical advances kept many alive who in earlier wars would have perished, but survival often meant a lifetime of pain and disability. Beyond the physical injuries, there was the torment of memory. Men who had endured the trenches, the mud, the constant shelling, and the loss of comrades suffered nightmares, anxiety, and what was then called shell shock. In an era that understood little about mental health, many veterans were treated as cowards or malingerers rather than victims of trauma. Civilians bore the war's burdens as well. Towns near the front lines in France and Belgium were reduced to rubble. Entire villages disappeared beneath artillery bombardments. Far from the battlefields, hunger and privation spread as blockades cut off food and supplies. In Central and Eastern Europe, millions were uprooted as borders shifted, creating waves of refugees who wandered a continent in chaos. For children growing up amid the war, normal life, schooling, stability, safety was shattered. The grief was especially profound in communities that lost a generation of young men. In small English villages, memorials list dozens of names, often representing brothers, cousins, and childhood friends who went off together and never returned. In France, the term la saignée, the bleeding, described how an entire generation had been cut down. In Germany, too, families mourned sons and fathers, even as the defeat deepened their anguish. No nation emerged untouched by sorrow. Governments and societies struggled with how to remember and honor the dead. Across Europe and beyond, memorials were erected, cenotaphs, statues, plaques, and vast cemeteries with rows of identical white crosses. The tomb of the unknown soldier, first created in France and later adopted by Britain, the United States, and others, symbolized the countless soldiers whose remains could not be identified. These monuments provided places of mourning in a world where many families had no graves to visit. Yet remembrance was not only about honoring sacrifice, it was also about shaping meaning. In Britain and France, ceremonies emphasized heroism and national resilience. In Germany, where the war ended in defeat, memory was more bitter, tinged with anger at the terms of Versailles and the belief that soldiers had been betrayed. In Eastern Europe, remembrance often became entangled with new national identities, as emerging states tried to connect their independence to the bloodshed in the conflict. Literature and art played a powerful role in capturing the human cost. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon wrote verses that stripped away illusions of glory, exposing the mud, blood, and futility of trench warfare. Novels such as Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front portrayed the war from the perspective of ordinary German soldiers, underscoring the shared suffering of all sides. Painters like Otto Dix depicted twisted bodies and ruined landscapes, images that unsettled viewers but conveyed truths that official memorials often softened. These works ensured that the war would not be remembered solely as a story of flags and victories, but as a human catastrophe. The memory of the war was not static. It evolved with time. In the 1920s, remembrance was fresh, personal, and often raw. By the 1930s, political movements sought to harness it. Fascists glorified the war as a crucible of strength and nationalism, while pacifists emphasized its futility and demanded never again. In Britain and France, annual Remembrance Day and Armistice Day ceremonies became solemn national rituals, moments to pause and recall both sacrifice and the fragility of peace. Even beyond Europe, the war's human cost shaped societies. In Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and other countries of the former British Empire, remembrance became part of national identity, honoring those who had fought far from home. In the Middle East and Africa, where colonial troops were drawn into a European war, memory was more complicated, often overlooked in official narratives, but deeply felt in communities that had contributed and suffered. The war also changed how people thought about death itself. The sheer numbers of the dead forced new ways of coping. Mass cemeteries replaced family burials, and governments assumed responsibility for commemorating their fallen citizens. Mourning was no longer only a private matter, it became a public, collective experience. The silence observed at the 11th hour of the 11th day each year was both personal and communal, a way of binding grief into ritual. Ultimately, the memory of the Great War became both a burden and a warning. For some, it inspired determination to avoid another catastrophe. For others, it fueled resentment that prepared the ground for future conflict. The human cost was undeniable, but its meaning was contested. What united all perspectives was the recognition that the war had changed the world forever, not only in politics and borders, but in the hearts of millions who lived with loss. Section 15. The collapse of old orders and the rise of new powers. The First World War not only ended lives, it also ended empires. Monarchies that had ruled for centuries fell within months, swept away by defeat, revolution, and the sheer exhaustion of war. The old order of Europe, the system of emperors, kings, and dynasties, collapsed, and in its place came fragile republics, revolutionary movements, and new nations struggling to find their footing. Germany, once the proud German Empire under Kaiser Wilhelm II, was the most visible example. In early November 1918, as defeat loomed and revolution broke out in German cities, the Kaiser abdicated and fled into exile. In his place, a republic was proclaimed in Berlin. What became known as the Weimar Republic inherited not only the burden of defeat, but also a fractured society. Monarchists mourned the loss of the empire, while workers' councils demanded socialist revolution. The military, disillusioned but still powerful, simmered with resentment. It was a fragile experiment in democracy, born in crisis and destined to face storms it could not easily withstand. Austria-Hungary fared even worse. The sprawling, multi-ethnic empire had always been precarious, held together by the authority of the Habsburg dynasty. War shattered that delicate balance. By the autumn of 1918, nationalities within the empire, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, and others, declared independence one after another. The empire disintegrated almost overnight. What remained was a much smaller Austria and a separate Hungary, while new states like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia emerged from the ruins. The Habsburg monarchy, which had reigned for centuries, simply ceased to exist. The Ottoman Empire, too, collapsed under the strain of war. Defeated in the Middle East by British and Arab forces, Its lands were divided up under mandates controlled by Britain and France. Ancient provinces like Syria, Palestine, and Iraq passed into foreign hands. In Anatolia itself, a nationalist movement led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk rose up to resist partition, ultimately creating modern Turkey. The Ottoman Sultan, once seen as both ruler and caliph, was reduced to irrelevance, and the old empire that had dominated the Near East for centuries was gone. Even Russia, technically on the side of the victors, saw its empire collapse in flames. The strain of war had triggered revolution in 1917. The Tsar was overthrown and later executed with his family. Out of the chaos, the Bolsheviks seized power, pulling Russia out of the war and beginning a civil conflict that would rage for years. The Russian Empire, which had stretched across continents, was gone, replaced by the Soviet Union, a new and radical experiment in governance built on communist ideology and determined to spread revolution abroad. The fall of these empires transformed the political landscape. In their place arose smaller nation-states, many created hastily and with borders that did not reflect ethnic realities. The principle of self-determination, championed by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, sounded noble, but in practice it often sowed discord. Poles, Czechs, Finns, Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians gained independence, but minorities within these states often felt marginalized. Where once a multi-ethnic empire had imposed order, now fractured societies struggled with competing nationalisms. The collapse of the old order also created space for new powers to rise. The United States, largely spared the destruction that ravaged Europe, emerged stronger. Its economy had boomed during the war, and its voice at the peace table was decisive. Though America would retreat into isolation in the 1920s, its influence on global affairs could no longer be ignored. Japan, too, emerged strengthened, having seized German colonies in Asia and established itself as a rising power in the Pacific. For Europeans, the unsettling reality was that the war had not only destroyed empires, it had shifted the balance of global power away from the old continent. This shift was not only geopolitical, but ideological. The war discredited old ideas of divine right monarchy and aristocratic rule. In their place came competing visions: liberal democracy, socialism, and communism. For some, the war was proof that democracy was the future. For others, the chaos of post-war societies showed democracy to be weak and unstable. Extremist movements, from Bolshevik revolutionaries in Russia to fascist groups in Italy, found fertile ground in the disillusionment left by war. The collapse of the old order also altered how people imagined authority. Monarchs and emperors had once seemed permanent, almost unshakable. By 1919, their palaces were empty, their crowns discarded, and their dynasties disgraced. Power was no longer seen as a birthright. It had to be earned or seized through ideology, elections, or revolution. This profound change in political culture would shape the entire 20th century. As the dust settled, people across Europe and the Middle East realized they were living in a new world. Borders were different, governments were untested, and the certainty of the past was gone. For some, this was a moment of hope, a chance to build freer societies. For others, it was terrifying, a loss of stability and identity. The collapse of the old orders had opened the door to both promise and peril, setting the stage for struggles that would continue long after the guns of 1918 fell silent. Section 16. The Treaty of Versailles and the Fragile Peace. The armistice of November 1918 brought silence to the battlefields, but peace was still far away. The victors faced the immense challenge of rebuilding a shattered world, and much of that responsibility fell to the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Delegates from more than 30 nations gathered, but the real decisions lay in the hands of the so-called Big Four. Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Each came with competing visions of what the post-war order should look like, and their disagreements shaped the settlement that followed. For Wilson, the war was supposed to end not in vengeance, but in justice. His famous 14 points outlined a vision of open diplomacy, self-determination for nations, and the creation of a League of Nations that could prevent future conflicts. Wilson hoped the war could be remembered as the one that made the world safe for democracy. Yet idealism collided with the hard realities of politics, especially when it came to France. France had borne the brunt of the Western Front. Towns and farmland lay in ruins. More than 1 million French soldiers were dead, and memories of German invasion ran deep. For Clemenceau, nicknamed the Tiger, security was everything. He wanted to make sure Germany could never again threaten France. That meant crippling its military, reclaiming Alsace-Lorraine, and demanding massive reparations to rebuild French industry and infrastructure. To Clemenceau, Wilson's idealism seemed dangerously naive. Britain's position was more complicated. Lloyd George faced public opinion at home that demanded Germany pay the price, especially after years of submarine warfare and Zeppelin raids. At the same time, he understood that Europe needed Germany's economy to recover. A completely ruined Germany might drag the rest of Europe into crisis, or turn to radical ideologies. Balancing these competing pressures, Britain sought a settlement that punished but did not totally destroy Germany. Italy, meanwhile, had entered the war with promises of territorial rewards. Orlando hoped to gain land along the Adriatic and expand Italy's influence. Yet Italy often found itself sidelined by the greater powers, and its dissatisfaction with the peace would later fuel nationalist resentment. Germany, the defeated power at the center of it all, was excluded from the negotiations. Its representatives were summoned only when the terms had already been written. This exclusion fueled bitterness, as Germans felt they were being humiliated rather than consulted in shaping a new Europe. The treaty they received in May 1919 shocked them. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, declared that Germany bore sole responsibility for the conflict. This was not just symbolic. It became the legal basis for demanding reparations of 132 billion gold marks, a sum so vast it seemed impossible to pay. Germany also lost 13% of its territory, including Alsace-Lorraine to France, the Polish corridor to the newly created Poland, and all of its overseas colonies. The Saar region was placed under international administration, and the Rhineland was demilitarized. Germany's military was dismantled. The army was reduced to 100,000 men, with no conscription, no tanks, no heavy artillery, and no air force. The navy was cut to a handful of ships, and submarines were banned. For a country that had once boasted Europe's most formidable army, this was nothing short of humiliation. In Germany, outrage erupted. Politicians called the treaty a diktat, a dictated peace imposed without negotiation. Many ordinary Germans could not reconcile the defeat with what they had been told by their leaders throughout the war, that victory was near, that German armies were undefeated in the field. The idea that politicians and civilians had stabbed the army in the back began to spread, a dangerous myth that extremists would later exploit. In the United States, meanwhile, Wilson faced his own difficulties. He returned home determined to secure American membership in the League of Nations, but the Senate resisted. Many senators feared that joining the League would drag America into future wars. In the end, the United States never ratified the Treaty of Versailles, leaving the League weakened from the start. For the victors, the treaty was presented as a necessary guarantee of peace. For the defeated, it was seen as unjust and vindictive, and for historians, it has remained one of the most debated documents of the 20th century. Was it too harsh, planting the seeds of future conflict by humiliating Germany? Or was it too lenient, leaving Germany strong enough to recover and challenge Europe again? What is certain is that the Treaty of Versailles created a fragile peace. It ended the war on paper, but it did not end the resentments, fears, and ambitions that had fueled it. Instead, it left behind unresolved tensions, particularly in Germany, where humiliation and anger smoldered beneath the surface. These tensions would not fade. They would fester, shaping politics for decades to come. Section 17. War reparations and economic turmoil. The Treaty of Versailles demanded that Germany pay an enormous financial price for the war. Reparations were not just symbolic. They were meant to cover the immense destruction in France and Belgium, rebuild shattered economies, and repay Allied debts, especially to the United States. But the sum, 132 billion gold marks, was staggering. To many Germans, it seemed deliberately impossible, designed to cripple the nation forever. At first, Germany tried to resist. The Weimar Republic, the new democratic government born from the collapse of the Kaiserreich, was fragile and unpopular. Its leaders signed the treaty reluctantly, and many Germans saw them as traitors. Yet refusing to comply risked renewed Allied invasion. With little choice, Germany began to make payments, but almost immediately the strain was unbearable. The early 1920s became years of economic chaos. Factories struggled to restart production after wartime disruption, and the loss of territory cut off key resources. The Saar's coal mines, once a major source of energy, were placed under international control. The new state of Poland claimed lands rich in agriculture and industry. To raise funds, the German government increased taxes and borrowed heavily, but revenue never matched the reparation schedule. In 1923, Germany fell behind on payments. France and Belgium responded by occupying the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. They intended to seize coal and steel directly as reparations. German workers, encouraged by their government, went on strike in protest, refusing to cooperate with the occupiers. The government printed money to pay them, unleashing one of the most catastrophic episodes of hyperinflation in modern history. Prices spiraled out of control. In early 1923, a loaf of bread cost a few hundred marks. By November, it cost 200 billion. People carried banknotes in wheelbarrows, and children built kites out of worthless currency. Middle-class families saw their life savings vanish overnight, while workers on fixed wages could no longer afford food. Pensioners who had carefully saved for retirement were left destitute. Hyperinflation had a devastating psychological impact. It eroded trust in the government, deepened resentment toward Versailles, and created fertile ground for extremists. Many Germans became convinced that democracy was weak, incapable of protecting them from humiliation and poverty. This crisis left scars that would shape German politics for years to come. International leaders soon recognized that the reparations problem was destabilizing all of Europe. If Germany collapsed economically, the Allies would never be paid, and the ripple effects would endanger recovery elsewhere. In 1924, the Dawes Plan was introduced, named after American banker Charles G. Dawes. It restructured payments, making them smaller and more manageable at first, with amounts increasing as Germany's economy recovered. American banks also provided loans to Germany, helping to stabilize its currency and revive industry. For a time, this plan worked. The mid-1920s brought a period of relative stability. German cities rebuilt, culture flourished in the golden 20s, and optimism returned cautiously. Yet the system was fragile. It relied heavily on American loans. When the Wall Street crash of 1929 unleashed the Great Depression, the entire structure collapsed. The Young Plan of 1929 had further reduced reparations and spread them over many decades, but by then, the global economy was crumbling. American lenders called in their loans, German banks collapsed, and unemployment soared. By 1932, over 6 million Germans were jobless. Breadlines grew, despair spread, and democracy faltered once more. Reparations had become more than an economic burden. They were a symbol of humiliation. Political extremists seized on them relentlessly. The Nazis, in particular, promised to repudiate Versailles altogether, restore national pride, and revive prosperity. Their message resonated with millions who felt betrayed by both the Allies and their own leaders. The reparation system itself unraveled. By 1931, payments were suspended indefinitely. In practical terms, Germany never paid the full amount set in Versailles, but the damage had already been done. The years of economic collapse, humiliation, and hardship fueled resentment that could not be erased. Beyond Germany, reparations had ripple effects across Europe. France used its share to rebuild devastated regions, but its insistence on enforcement strained relations with Britain and the United States. Britain, while demanding payments, also realized that strangling Germany risked strangling European trade. Meanwhile, countries that had borrowed heavily from the U.S. to finance the war depended on reparations to repay their debts. The entire system was a precarious financial pyramid, Germany paying the Allies paying America, that collapsed when the foundation gave way. The lesson of reparations was sobering. Economic punishment, when pushed beyond a nation's capacity to endure, could destabilize not just the defeated, but the victors as well. Instead of securing peace, reparations deepened resentment, fueled extremism, and left Europe vulnerable to future conflict. By the mid-1930s, the reparations issue was effectively dead, but its political legacy was very much alive. In Germany, it had provided the Nazis with a powerful rallying cry. Across Europe, it had shown how fragile peace could be when economics and politics pulled in opposite directions. What was intended as justice had instead planted the seeds of instability. Section 18. The Lost Generation and Cultural Shifts. The First World War did not simply redraw borders or topple empires. It shattered an entire generation's sense of meaning. The young men who had marched off in 1914, many full of patriotic enthusiasm, returned, if they returned at all, physically broken, mentally scarred, and spiritually disillusioned. They had seen modern industry turned into an engine of slaughter, where artillery shells, poison gas, and machine guns shredded human bodies in numbers unimaginable just a few years earlier. Writers and thinkers began to call them the lost generation. The phrase, made famous by Gertrude Stein and popularized by Ernest Hemingway, captured not only the veterans' despair, but also the alienation felt by those who had lived through the upheaval. Old values of honor, sacrifice, and national pride seemed hollow after the trenches. What meaning was there in a war that had killed millions and changed so little? The trauma was not confined to soldiers. Families across Europe carried the burden of grief. Communities had lost entire cohorts of young men. In Britain, Almost every town and village erected war memorials listing names of the fallen. In France, some villages never recovered from losing nearly all their adult males. Widows and orphans struggled in poverty. The silence of missing voices at dinner tables or in workshops was a wound that never healed. Psychological scars, though less visible, were equally devastating. Shell shock, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, afflicted tens of thousands. Men suffered nightmares, tremors, and uncontrollable panic. Many were institutionalized, others faced stigma and misunderstanding. Military authorities often treated shell shock as cowardice, punishing rather than healing. The legacy of trauma would haunt families for decades. Amid the wreckage, cultural life shifted dramatically. The war accelerated social changes that had been building before 1914. With so many men at the front, women had stepped into factories, farms, offices, and transport jobs. They proved themselves capable in roles once reserved for men, and when the war ended, many refused to return quietly to traditional domestic spheres. In several countries, Britain, the United States, Germany, women gained the right to vote in the immediate post-war years, a recognition of their contributions and a step toward broader gender equality. Yet this newfound independence also brought tension. Many men, struggling with unemployment and trauma, resented women's continuing presence in the workforce. For women themselves, the post-war years were bittersweet. Opportunities had expanded, but expectations of marriage and domestic life remained strong. Still, the door had been opened, and society could never fully turn back. Artists, writers, and musicians gave voice to the confusion of the age. The poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon rejected romantic visions of war, instead portraying its horror with brutal honesty. Owen's line, "The old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori," became emblematic of a generation that no longer believed dying for one's country was sweet or fitting. In literature, novelists like Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Eric Maria Remarque depicted characters drifting through life, numbed by loss or seeking escape in pleasure and excess. Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front became one of the most powerful anti-war novels ever written, banned by the Nazis but embraced by millions who saw their own despair reflected in its pages. Visual arts exploded into radical experimentation. Dadaism, born in Zurich during the war, mocked the absurdity of modern society with chaotic, nonsensical works. Surrealism, rising in the 1920s, sought to explore the unconscious mind as a response to a world that seemed irrational. These movements challenged traditional aesthetics, insisting that after such destruction, art could never simply return to pre-war forms. Music, too, reflected change. Jazz, with its improvisation and energy, spread from the United States across Europe. It symbolized liberation, a break from old rules. For many, jazz was the soundtrack of the 1920s, a way to dance away memories of war. In places like Paris and Berlin, nightclubs thrived, offering escape, though always under a shadow of unease. The term "lost generation" also spoke to shifting morality. With so much death and uncertainty, many people sought immediate pleasure. Alcohol consumption rose, nightlife boomed, and social conventions loosened. In Berlin, especially during the Weimar years, avant-garde culture pushed boundaries in art, sexuality, and politics. Conservative voices decried this as decadence, but for others, it was freedom, the only answer to the pointlessness of war. Religion, too, was unsettled. Many questioned faith in a just God after such slaughter. Church attendance declined in parts of Europe, while alternative spiritual movements gained followers. At the same time, others clung more fiercely to religion as a source of stability in a fractured world. The war had unsettled not only geopolitics, but also the deepest foundations of belief. Despite the despair, the lost generation also produced extraordinary creativity. Out of disillusionment came works of art, literature, and philosophy that still resonate today. The war had forced humanity to confront uncomfortable truths about technology, nationalism, and the fragility of civilization. The voices of that generation continue to remind us of the cost of conflict, not just in lives lost, but in faith, meaning, and hope eroded. By the late 1920s, many hoped that time and prosperity might heal the wounds. Yet, beneath the jazz and optimism, the trauma remained. Veterans carried their scars into politics, shaping movements both democratic and extremist. The social changes unleashed by the war, women's rights, modernist culture, disillusionment with authority, were irreversible. A generation had been lost, but from its pain, the modern world was being born. Section 19. New Nations and Redrawn Borders. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, it wasn't just armies that collapsed. It was entire empires. The Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, German, and Russian empires, which had dominated vast stretches of Europe and the Middle East for centuries, were suddenly gone or fatally weakened. Into the vacuum stepped new nations, drawn from the ambitions of nationalists, the principles of self-determination, and the calculations of victorious powers. The map of Europe and the Middle East was redrawn almost overnight, but the borders that emerged carried as many problems as they solved. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was perhaps the most obvious casualty. A state stitched together from dozens of ethnic groups: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, Romanians, Poles. It had always been fragile. War only worsened its fault lines. By late 1918, Czechoslovakia declared independence, uniting Czechs and Slovaks under one government. South Slavs, Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes formed a kingdom that would later be known as Yugoslavia. Hungary split from Austria, and each tried to assert itself as a sovereign state. For Vienna, once the glittering capital of empire, the post-war years meant adjusting to life as the center of a small, landlocked republic. To the east, Poland was reborn after more than a century of being carved up by its neighbors. The Treaty of Versailles restored Polish independence, but the country's new borders were contested almost immediately. Poland fought wars with both Soviet Russia and Ukraine over territory, eventually emerging with lands that contained large numbers of non-Poles, including Germans, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. For many Poles, independence was a dream fulfilled. For their neighbors, it was a source of fresh tension. The Russian Empire, already convulsed by revolution and civil war, also saw pieces break away. Finland declared independence in 1917. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania soon followed, establishing fragile republics along the Baltic coast. These states would struggle for survival, caught between Soviet ambitions to the east and German revanchism to the west. Though their independence was recognized in the early 1920s, their position remained precarious. The Ottoman Empire's collapse reshaped not only Europe, but the Middle East. British and French leaders, who had promised Arab independence during the war, instead carved the region into mandates under League of Nations supervision. Britain took control of Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq, while France assumed power over Syria and Lebanon. These new borders often ignored ethnic, tribal, and religious realities, planting seeds of conflict that still linger today. Arabs who had fought alongside the Allies under leaders like T.E. Lawrence felt betrayed, their hopes for genuine independence dashed. Meanwhile, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk led Turkish nationalists in resisting Allied occupation, eventually founding the modern Republic of Turkey from the ruins of Ottoman territory. Germany's own borders were cut back significantly. Alsace and Lorraine returned to France. Eupen and Malmedy went to Belgium. Poland was awarded parts of Prussia, and the city of Danzig became a free city under League supervision. The Rhineland was demilitarized, and Germany lost all of its overseas colonies. For many Germans, these territorial losses were bitter, symbols of humiliation that fed resentment and a desire for revision. Italy, though technically on the winning side, left the war dissatisfied. It had been promised territory in the 1915 Treaty of London, but received far less than expected at Versailles. Nationalists fumed about the mutilated victory, a grievance that later fueled Benito Mussolini's rise and the appeal of fascism. In the Balkans, borders were even more complicated. Yugoslavia was supposed to unite South Slavs, but deep divisions between Serbs, Croats, and Slovens quickly appeared. Romania gained large swathes of land, including Transylvania, doubling its size but also incorporating millions of minorities. Bulgaria, punished for siding with the Central Powers, lost territory to its neighbors and seethed with resentment. Across the Middle East, new nations were created on paper, but rarely matched realities on the ground. Iraq, cobbled together from 3 former Ottoman provinces, contained Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, and Kurds, groups with little shared history. In Palestine, the British found themselves caught between promises to Arabs and the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which had pledged support for a Jewish homeland. The conflicting commitments would lead to decades of unrest. Even in Western Europe, the shifting map caused friction. France's recovery of Alsace-Lorraine brought celebrations, but integrating populations who had lived under German rule for decades was not easy. In Ireland, the war had heightened tensions that soon boiled into revolution, leading to the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922. The redrawn borders reflected the principle of self-determination, championed by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, but in practice, self-determination was uneven. While some groups gained independence, others were denied it. Colonized peoples in Asia and Africa, who had contributed soldiers and resources to the Allied cause, hoped the post-war settlement would recognize their right to self-rule. Instead, they found themselves still under European control, sparking early independence movements from India to Vietnam. The world after 1918 was thus a patchwork of new states, old resentments, and unresolved disputes. For some, independence was a triumph. For others, it was an illusion. The great empires had fallen, but in their place arose fragile nations often struggling with legitimacy, diversity, and economic survival. The new map of Europe and the Middle East was less a blueprint for peace than a temporary truce. Beneath its lines lay tensions that would resurface within a generation. The collapse of the old order had created opportunity, but also instability. The next 2 decades would reveal just how fragile this new system really was. Section 20. Seeds of Future Conflict and the Road to World War II. The First World War had been called the War to End All Wars, but by the 1920s and 1930s, it became clear that the settlement reached at Versailles had planted the seeds for an even greater catastrophe. The war had ended empires, redrawn borders, and created new nations, but it had also left bitterness, humiliation, and economic instability across much of the world. Far from creating lasting peace, The treaties of 1919 to 1920 created conditions that extremists would later exploit. Germany was the most obvious case. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed harsh terms: territorial losses, disarmament, and reparations payments that strained its economy to the breaking point. Even more damaging was the infamous war guilt clause, which forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war. For ordinary Germans, this felt like an insult piled on top of defeat. They had seen their army still on foreign soil when the armistice was signed, and many believed that they had been betrayed by politicians, not beaten in the field. This became known as the stab-in-the-back myth, a poisonous idea that claimed Germany had been undermined by Jews, communists, and traitors at home. It was false, but it resonated deeply with veterans and civilians who felt humiliated and angry. The new Weimar Republic, born in the ashes of the monarchy, struggled from the start. Hyperinflation in 1923 wiped out life savings, leaving pensioners destitute and workers paid in worthless banknotes. In 1929, the Great Depression struck, sending unemployment soaring and further destabilizing the fragile democracy. Extremist parties thrived in this chaos. On the left, communists promised revolution and a workers' state. On the right, nationalists and fascists promised strength, unity, and revenge. Among them was Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, who built their platform on overturning Versailles, restoring German pride, and blaming minorities for the nation's troubles. Germany was not alone in feeling betrayed by the post-war order. Italy, despite being on the winning side, had expected far more territory than it received. Nationalists railed against the mutilated victory, claiming Italy had been cheated of its rightful spoils. This resentment fueled the rise of Benito Mussolini and his fascist party, which seized power in 1922. Mussolini promised to restore Italy's greatness, revive the Roman legacy, and crush communism. In Eastern Europe, the new states carved out of old empires faced instability of their own. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia brought together diverse populations with different languages, religions, and histories. Poland's borders were contested almost immediately, leading to wars with Soviet Russia and neighboring states. Romania and Hungary quarreled over Transylvania. The dream of self-determination clashed with the reality of mixed populations, and the result was tension, unrest, and minority grievances. Beyond Europe, the disappointment was just as sharp. Colonized peoples who had hoped the principle of self-determination would apply to them discovered otherwise. In India, the end of the war saw rising nationalist protests against British rule. In China, the decision to hand German colonies in Shandong to Japan rather than return them to Chinese sovereignty sparked outrage in the May 4th movement. In the Middle East, Arabs who had fought for independence found themselves under British and French mandates instead. These betrayals did not spark immediate wars, but they fueled resentment and independence movements that would simmer for decades. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks had turned Russia's revolution into a communist state. By the early 1920s, the Soviet Union was consolidating its power under Lenin, and later, Stalin. For much of Europe, communism seemed both a terrifying threat and an attractive alternative. Workers disillusioned with capitalism looked east for inspiration, while conservative elites feared revolution spreading across borders. This ideological divide between capitalism, communism, and the new fascist movements would become one of the defining features of the interwar years. The League of Nations, created to preserve peace, proved too weak to address these challenges. Lacking the participation of the United States and real enforcement power, the League could mediate disputes but not compel solutions. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the League condemned the aggression but did nothing. Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 was met with half-hearted sanctions that Mussolini ignored. These failures made it clear that international institutions could not restrain ambitious powers determined to expand. By the mid-1930s, Germany was rearming in open defiance of Versailles, Italy was building its empire, and Japan was carving out a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The global economic crisis had shattered faith in democracy and fueled the appeal of authoritarian regimes that promised swift action and national revival. World War I had been meant to settle Europe's problems. Instead, it created a fragile, resentful order, full of unstable governments and unresolved disputes. The collapse of old empires had not been replaced with stability, but with uncertainty. And in the shadows, men like Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin saw opportunity. The peace of 1919 had been a pause, not a resolution. Within 20 years, the world would learn that the Great War had not been the war to end all wars, but merely the opening act of a much darker drama. Section 21. The Lost Generation and Cultural Impact. The Great War left scars that went far deeper than battlefields and borders. It shattered an entire generation's sense of meaning, hope, and trust in the old world. Millions of young men had marched off to war in 1914, filled with patriotic fervor, believing in honor, glory, and quick victory. What they experienced instead was mud, shells, poison gas, and the relentless grind of industrial slaughter. For those who survived, returning home did not mean returning to normal life. The trauma of the trenches lingered, and society itself had changed beyond recognition. This cultural dislocation gave rise to what came to be called the lost generation. The term, popularized by writer Gertrude Stein and immortalized by Ernest Hemingway, captured the feelings of aimlessness and disillusionment that haunted veterans and young people alike. These men and women had seen ideals destroyed on the battlefield. Nationalism, once a rallying cry, felt hollow. Faith in political leaders, institutions, and even religion was shaken. Many felt cut adrift in a world where the old values no longer applied. For soldiers, the war had left both visible and invisible wounds. Millions came home with shattered bodies, missing limbs, disfigured faces, or crippled by disease and gas damage. Millions more carried psychological scars. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder was then known simply as shell shock. At the time, it was poorly understood and often treated as weakness or cowardice. Men who had endured years of bombardment and death often found themselves unable to hold steady jobs, plagued by nightmares, or alienated from families who could not understand their pain. In the broader society, grief was everywhere. Entire towns in Britain and France had lost most of their young men. War memorials rose in village squares across Europe, each etched with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of names. For families, there was often no grave to visit. Many soldiers lay buried in mass graves or were never identified. The unknown soldier became a symbol of this collective mourning, representing the countless lives lost without recognition. Yet even amid grief, the war accelerated enormous social changes. Women, who had taken up roles in factories, offices, and farms during the war, proved that they were capable of much more than traditional domestic work. In many countries, this strengthened movements for women's suffrage. Britain granted voting rights to women over 30 in 1918, and younger women gained it a decade later. Similar advances occurred elsewhere, setting the stage for broader gender equality movements throughout the 20th century. Art and literature became powerful outlets for processing the trauma. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon wrote verses that stripped away illusions of glory, depicting war as mud, blood, and senseless suffering. Owen's lines, "The old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori," condemned the romantic notion that it was sweet and fitting to die for one's country. These works resonated deeply with audiences who had seen the cost of war firsthand. Writers of the 1920s expressed the disillusionment of the age in different ways. Hemingway's novels, such as The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms, portrayed characters searching for meaning in a fractured world. F. Scott Fitzgerald captured the restless hedonism of the Roaring Twenties, where parties and jazz became a kind of escape from the grim shadows of war. T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, dense and fragmented, mirrored the cultural breakdown and sense of despair that lingered after 1918. In visual art, the war fueled radical experimentation. The Dada movement rejected logic and embraced absurdity, a reflection of a world that seemed to have lost all sense. Surrealism explored dreams, the subconscious, and irrational imagery as a way to break free from the horrors of reality. Artists like Otto Dix painted haunting, grotesque images of wounded veterans and battlefield carnage, confronting society with reminders it often preferred to forget. Music, too, reflected this cultural shift. The jazz age exploded in the 1920s, symbolizing energy, rebellion, and new freedoms. Originating in African American communities in the United States, jazz spread rapidly to Europe, where its improvisation and vibrancy stood in stark contrast to the rigid order of pre-war culture. For many, it became the soundtrack of the lost generation, both celebratory and melancholic, embodying the search for life after devastation. Religion, once a cornerstone of society, faced profound challenges. For countless believers, reconciling faith with the scale of suffering proved impossible. Church attendance declined in many places, while new spiritual and philosophical movements emerged. Some turned to humanism, existentialism, or political ideologies in search of answers. Others clung even more tightly to faith, finding solace in the belief that sacrifice and suffering had higher meaning. In politics, the trauma of war drove people in different directions. Some gravitated toward pacifism, convinced that war should never again be allowed to happen. Others turned to radical ideologies, communism, fascism, or militant nationalism that promised order, strength, and revival in a shattered world. The lost generation was not just about artists and intellectuals. It was about millions of ordinary people whose lives had been torn apart, searching for new structures of meaning. The cultural legacy of the lost generation was profound. It revealed the human cost of modern war, not just in lives lost, but in values questioned and societies unsettled. The works of its writers, artists, and musicians still resonate today, offering a window into the psychological aftermath of the Great War. They remind us that the effects of conflict are not only political or territorial, they are deeply personal, reshaping how entire generations see the world. Section 22. Redrawing the Map, New Nations and Borders. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, the physical destruction of Europe was plain to see, but beneath the rubble lay an even greater transformation. The political map of the continent was about to be redrawn. The collapse of empires that had once dominated vast territories left a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped a new world of nations, borders, and identities. It was one of the most dramatic political shifts in modern history, and its consequences would shape the rest of the 20th century. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, a sprawling patchwork of ethnicities, languages, and religions, disintegrated almost overnight. For centuries, Vienna had held together Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, Poles, and more under one imperial crown. But by 1918, nationalist movements had gathered strength, and the strain of total war had broken whatever fragile unity remained. Within months, Czechoslovakia declared independence. Yugoslavia was born by uniting South Slavic peoples, and Hungary separated from Austria. The Habsburg monarchy, which had seemed eternal, suddenly vanished into history. The Ottoman Empire, once stretching across the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe, also collapsed. Years of defeats, Arab revolts, and Allied campaigns had gutted its military and shaken its rule. The empire signed the armistice of Mudros in October 1918, effectively marking its end. Yet instead of independence for its many peoples, much of its former territory was carved up by the victors. Britain and France divided the Middle East into spheres of control through the Mandate system, taking charge of Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan. Promises made to Arab leaders during the War for Independence clashed with new realities of European colonial control, planting seeds of tension that remain alive to this day. Germany, too, lost vast areas of territory. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France, a symbolic reversal of the humiliating loss in 1871. To the east, large swathes of German land were given to the newly reborn Poland, including access to the sea through the so-called Polish Corridor. Danzig became a free city under League of Nations protection, while the resource-rich Saar region was placed under international administration. Germany's overseas colonies in Africa and the Pacific were confiscated and distributed among the Allies. These losses were not only humiliating, but also economically crippling, fueling resentment that would fester in the years to come. Meanwhile, new nations emerged from the ashes of empire. Poland, absent from the map of Europe for more than a century, returned as a sovereign state. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania all declared independence as the Russian Empire, racked by revolution and civil war, withdrew from its former possessions. The Baltic states faced constant threats from both Bolshevik Russia and Germany, but their emergence symbolized a new era of national self-determination. In the Balkans, the new kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later called Yugoslavia, was created in hopes of uniting South Slavs into one state. Yet from the start, internal divisions plagued it, as different ethnic groups held competing visions of identity and power. Similar tensions simmered in Czechoslovakia, where Czechs and Slovaks had to balance unity with distinct cultural traditions. These fragile experiments in nationhood were celebrated at the time as victories for self-determination, but also carried seeds of future conflict. Woodrow Wilson's principle of self-determination had inspired many of these new nations, but in practice, the process was messy and imperfect. Borders were drawn hastily, sometimes without regard to the ethnic and cultural realities on the ground. As a result, millions of people found themselves minorities in newly formed states: Hungarians in Romania, Germans in Czechoslovakia, Poles in Lithuania, and countless others scattered across shifting frontiers. The hope of stable, self-governing nations often clashed with the reality of contested borders and uneasy coexistence. Beyond Europe, the redrawing of the map also stirred movements in Asia and Africa. Colonies that had supplied manpower and resources to the war effort began to demand recognition and greater autonomy. In India, The war had fueled hopes of progress towards self-rule, but Britain remained reluctant, leading to growing nationalist movements. In China, the transfer of former German territories in Shandong to Japan under the Treaty of Versailles provoked outrage and helped spark the May 4th movement, a wave of anti-imperialist protest that shaped modern Chinese nationalism. Across the world, the rhetoric of self-determination exposed the contradictions of colonial empires that denied those very rights to millions of their subjects. The League of Nations, established in 1920, was meant to oversee this new world order and provide a framework for resolving disputes. Yet the League lacked real enforcement power, and its mandate system often looked more like colonialism under a different name. Many saw it as a tool of the great powers rather than a genuine vehicle for equality among nations. Still, the League represented the first major attempt at collective international governance, laying a foundation that would later inspire the United Nations. The new political map of Europe after 1918 looked radically different from the one that had existed before the war. Monarchies had fallen, republics had risen, and the principle of national self-determination had reshaped the continent. Yet this new order was fragile. Many of the new borders were contested, many minorities were dissatisfied, and many old powers were resentful of their losses. What was celebrated as the birth of a new Europe was, in truth, the beginning of a long and difficult struggle to balance national ambitions with the realities of geography and history. The redrawing of the map after World War I marked both hope and danger. It represented liberation for many peoples, but also instability that would haunt the decades ahead. The world had hoped that by reshaping borders, it might prevent another conflict. Instead, it created a patchwork of fragile states and unresolved grievances that would contribute to the outbreak of another, even deadlier war. Section 23, Seeds of Future Conflict, How World War I Led to World War II. The guns of 1918 had barely fallen silent when the seeds of the next global conflict were already taking root. Though the First World War had been declared the war to end all wars, its aftermath instead created an unstable world, one riddled with bitterness, economic collapse, and unresolved grievances. Within 2 decades, those conditions would explode into a second, even more devastating war. The most obvious legacy was the Treaty of Versailles. Signed in June 1919, it imposed crushing reparations on Germany, stripped it of territory, and declared it solely responsible for the war. To many Germans, the treaty was not a peace settlement, but a humiliation. The war guilt clause became a national wound, a constant reminder that the Allies viewed Germany as uniquely guilty, even though Austro-Hungary, Russia, and others had played major roles in the war's outbreak. Politicians in Weimar Germany branded Versailles a diktat, a dictated peace forced upon them at gunpoint. This resentment fueled nationalist movements and gave demagogues like Adolf Hitler the rhetoric they needed to rally a wounded nation. Economics deepened the wound. Germany was ordered to pay reparations amounting to billions of marks, an impossible sum for a country already devastated by war. In 1923, when Germany defaulted on payments, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr industrial region, seizing coal and steel. German workers went on strike, and the government printed money to support them, leading to one of the worst hyperinflations in history. Wheelbarrows of worthless paper money could barely buy bread. Middle-class families who had saved their whole lives lost everything overnight. The trauma of this collapse scarred a generation and made many Germans distrustful of democracy and vulnerable to extremists promising stability and revenge. While Germany was the epicenter of post-war bitterness, it was not alone in feeling cheated by Versailles. Italy, though on the winning side, believed it had been denied territories promised by the Allies and spoke of a mutilated victory. Japan, which had fought alongside Britain and seized German colonies in the Pacific, was angered that its proposal for racial equality in the League of Nations was rejected. In Eastern Europe, the new states carved from empires often found themselves in constant disputes over borders and minorities, breeding hostility instead of stability. Versailles may have ended one war, but it left almost every major power dissatisfied. Meanwhile, Russia had undergone its own revolution, withdrawing from the war in 1917 after the Bolsheviks seized power. Civil war tore the country apart, and though the communists emerged victorious, the new Soviet Union was isolated and distrusted by the West. The fear of communism, already spreading in Europe and America, added to the instability. To conservatives and nationalists, the specter of Bolshevism became a justification for authoritarian politics, while to the Soviet Union, capitalist hostility confirmed its belief that the world was aligned against it. The League of Nations, born of Woodrow Wilson's dream of collective security, was supposed to prevent future wars. Yet it lacked the power to enforce its resolutions and the participation of key players. The United States, ironically the architect of the League, never joined as the U.S. Senate rejected the treaty. Without American involvement, and with major powers like Germany and the Soviet Union initially excluded, the League was a hollow institution. Its inability to act decisively in crises, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, the Italian conquest of Ethiopia, would later prove its weakness. The Great Depression of 1929 further destabilized the fragile post-war order. As economies collapsed worldwide, millions lost jobs and faith in democratic governments. Extremist movements thrived on despair. In Germany, the Nazi Party rose from the fringes to mainstream power, promising not only to restore pride, but also to undo the Versailles settlement. In Japan, economic turmoil fueled military expansionism, while in Italy, Mussolini consolidated his fascist regime by promising national revival. The global economic crisis became the accelerator of political extremism. Underlying all this was a deeper cultural trauma. The First World War had shattered illusions about progress and civilization. Generations of young men had died in muddy trenches, and societies were left to mourn millions of dead and wounded. Faith in old institutions, monarchies, churches, even liberal democracy, was eroded. In its place grew radical ideologies that claimed to offer certainty and renewal: fascism, communism, and militarism. These movements were not merely political, but also emotional responses to a world that seemed broken beyond repair. Perhaps the cruelest irony was that the very measures intended to secure peace sowed the conditions for another war. Reparations were meant to weaken Germany, but instead they embittered it. Self-determination was meant to bring stability, but instead created fragile states with angry minorities. The League was meant to safeguard peace, but without real power, it could only watch as aggressive powers tested its limits. By the 1930s, it was clear that Versailles had not built a lasting peace, but rather a brittle, temporary pause between conflicts. The road from 1918 to 1939 was not inevitable. There were moments when compromise or stronger leadership might have contained the tensions. Yet the combination of economic catastrophe, nationalist resentment, weak international institutions, and the rise of extremist ideologies made another war increasingly likely. When Hitler marched troops into the Rhineland in 1936, when Japan invaded China in 1937, and when Mussolini expanded in Africa, the world stood by, paralyzed by fear and division. The First World War had ended, but its shadow stretched long into the decades that followed. By the late 1930s, the world realized too late that the so-called war to end all wars had only been the beginning. The seeds planted at Versailles, watered by economic collapse and political extremism, had grown into a new storm, one that would engulf the globe once again in fire. Lessons and legacies of World War I, how it shaped the modern world. When the guns fell silent on November 11th, 1918, few could have imagined just how deeply the Great War would continue to shape the decades ahead. Beyond the ruined battlefields and shattered empires, the First World War left a legacy that influenced politics, culture, technology, and the very way people thought about conflict. To understand the modern world, one must first understand how the war that began in 1914 reshaped almost every aspect of life. One of the most profound legacies was the collapse of centuries-old empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, a patchwork of ethnic groups loosely held together by monarchy, disintegrated into new nation-states like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire, which had once ruled vast territories across the Middle East, fell apart, leaving its lands divided between Britain and France under the Mandate system. Germany, stripped of its colonies and monarchy, became the unstable Weimar Republic, and Russia, shaken by revolution, became the Soviet Union. These collapses redrew maps, but also created tensions. Many of the new borders ignored ethnic realities, planting seeds of future conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The war also transformed the relationship between governments and citizens. To fight a total war, states had taken unprecedented control over economies and daily life. Food was rationed, industries nationalized, and propaganda spread to keep morale high. Women entered the workforce in vast numbers, replacing men at the factories and farms. This not only changed gender roles, but also gave momentum to suffrage movements. Within a few years, women gained the right to vote in countries such as Britain, the United States, and Germany. For many, the war was proof that women were just as capable in national service as men. Technology was another domain profoundly altered by the conflict. The war had accelerated innovation in ways both terrifying and transformative. Tanks, aircraft, submarines, and machine guns were perfected on the battlefield. Poison gas left soldiers blinded or scarred, giving chemical warfare a lasting reputation for horror. Yet these innovations also pushed civilian technologies forward. Aviation grew rapidly after the war, with former military pilots pioneering commercial flight routes. Advances in medicine, from surgery techniques to prosthetics, emerged from the urgent need to treat millions of wounded. Even communications improved, with radio becoming a powerful tool in both war and peace. On a cultural level, the war produced what became known as the lost generation. Millions of young men had been killed or returned home broken, while artists, writers, and thinkers wrestled with disillusionment. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon captured the senseless slaughter of the trenches in haunting verse. Writers such as Ernest Hemingway and Erich Maria Remarque gave voice to the alienation of veterans who felt disconnected from a world that no longer understood them. Art movements like Dadaism and Surrealism rejected traditional forms, reflecting the chaos and absurdity of the war experience. Music, literature, and painting all bore the scars of a generation grappling with shattered ideals. The war also transformed international relations. Out of the desire to prevent another catastrophe came the League of Nations, the first attempt at a permanent international body dedicated to peace. Though flawed and ultimately ineffective, the League was a milestone. It established the idea that international disputes could be managed collectively rather than through war. Its weaknesses, most notably the absence of the United States and the inability to enforce its resolutions, offered important lessons later applied in the creation of the United Nations after the Second World War. Economically, the war left behind staggering costs. Europe's financial dominance crumbled as countries sank into debt, particularly to the United States. America, relatively untouched by the devastation, emerged as the world's leading economic power. This shift marked the beginning of a new global order, with influence tilting away from Europe toward the United States. The debts and reparations system, however, left European economies fragile and contributed to the instability of the 1920s and the Great Depression of the 1930s. The psychological impact was just as significant. The sheer scale of death, over 16 million dead and 20 million wounded, changed how societies thought about war. Gone was the romantic notion of glory in battle. Instead, there was a deep awareness of the brutality of modern conflict. Memorials sprang up in nearly every town and city, from the Cenotaph in London to the Douaumont ossuary in Verdun, marking the sacrifice of ordinary soldiers. The tomb of the unknown soldier, first established in France and Britain, symbolized the anonymity of mass death in industrial war. Annual remembrance rituals, such as Armistice Day, ensured that the memory of the war remained vivid for generations. Perhaps most importantly, the First World War forced humanity to confront the fragility of peace. The conflict revealed how alliances, nationalism, militarism, and miscalculations could spiral into catastrophe. Though the lessons were not always heeded, they shaped political thought. Many intellectuals and activists dedicated themselves to pacifism and disarmament, movements that gained momentum during the 1920s. Others, scarred by defeat or humiliation, turned to nationalism and authoritarianism, sowing the conditions for new conflict. In the end, the First World War was more than just a 4-year struggle. It was a turning point in world history, a rupture between the old 19th century order and the turbulent 20th century. It destroyed monarchies, transformed societies, revolutionized warfare, and redrew the world map. Its legacy was everywhere, in the rise of women's rights, in the literature of disillusionment, in the birth of new ideologies, and in the haunting silence of remembrance ceremonies. Even today, more than a century later, the Great War continues to echo. The borders it created, the technologies it unleashed, and the ideas it sparked still shape our world. And the graves that stretch across Flanders, Verdun, and Gallipoli remind us of the price paid when humanity fails to prevent conflict. The First World War was not only a tragedy of its own time, but also a lesson for all time, that peace, however fragile, must be guarded with vigilance, wisdom, and humility. Section 25. Conclusion. The Great War's place in history. The First World War remains one of the most defining events in modern history, not only because of its immense scale of destruction, but also because of its enduring influence on the world that followed. When the conflict began in the summer of 1914, many thought it would be a short and decisive struggle. 4 years later, Europe lay in ruins, empires had collapsed, and millions of lives had been lost. What emerged was not a return to stability, but a transformed world, one that still carries the echoes of that cataclysm. At its core, the war revealed how fragile peace can be when nationalism, imperial ambitions, and alliance systems collide. A single gunshot in Sarajevo spiraled into a global conflict because of a web of promises and rivalries that no leader dared to break. This chain reaction showed how interconnected nations had become, and how a regional crisis could rapidly escalate into worldwide catastrophe. It is a lesson that continues to resonate in international politics today, where localized tensions often have global consequences. The First World War also dismantled illusions about the nature of modern warfare. Generals and statesmen who had spoken of glory, heroism, and swift campaigns were confronted with the grim reality of machine guns, trenches, and poison gas. Instead of decisive cavalry charges and rapid maneuvers, the war became a grinding stalemate where soldiers endured mud, rats, and constant fear. The romantic image of battle died in the trenches of the Somme, Verdun, and Passchendaele. In its place came a recognition that industrialized war was no longer a test of bravery alone, but a brutal contest of machines, manpower, and endurance. Politically, the war tore apart the old world order. Monarchs who had once seemed untouchable fell from their thrones. The Russian Revolution replaced the Tsar with a radical new ideology that would dominate global politics for decades. Germany's defeat created bitterness that extremists later exploited. In the Middle East, Ottoman lands were carved up into new states whose borders remain contentious today. Each of these political shifts was a direct consequence of the war, proof that the conflict was not just about battlefields, but about reshaping nations and identities. For societies, the war marked a point of no return. Millions of men who had gone to fight never came back, leaving behind grieving families and entire communities missing a generation. Those who returned were often scarred in body and mind, carrying wounds both visible and invisible. Civilians had endured hunger, rationing, air raids, and loss on a scale never seen before. The shared trauma bound societies together, but it also fueled discontent, radical movements, and demands for change. Women, who had stepped into roles left vacant by men, refused to return quietly to the margins. Their contributions in factories, hospitals, and offices gave weight to their demands for suffrage and equality. Culturally, the war shaped memory and imagination in ways that remain powerful. The poems of Wilfred Owen, the paintings of Otto Dix, the novels of Erich Maria Remarque, all captured the disillusionment of a generation that had seen the old ideals shattered. The silence of memorial ceremonies, the poppies of Flanders fields, and the names etched on countless war memorials became symbols of both sacrifice and futility. Through art and ritual, the war became part of the collective consciousness, teaching future generations not only what had happened, but what must never happen again. Perhaps the greatest paradox of the war lies in its aftermath. It was hailed as the war to end all wars. Yet within 2 decades, the world was engulfed in an even greater conflict. The Treaty of Versailles, intended to secure peace, instead sowed resentment and division. The failure of the League of Nations showed how fragile international cooperation still was. The economic devastation of the war contributed to the Great Depression, which in turn fueled extremism. In many ways, the Second World War was not a separate event, but a continuation of unresolved tensions from the first. And yet, the First World War did change humanity's outlook. It inspired international law, humanitarian efforts, and the recognition of the need for diplomacy over arms. It fostered innovation in medicine, engineering, and communication that reshaped civilian life. It brought forth voices that demanded justice, equality, and reform. Even through its destruction, it forced societies to reconsider their values, their responsibilities, and their future. Today, more than a century later, the Great War stands as both a warning and a teacher. Its cemeteries remind us of the cost of unchecked ambition and mistrust. Its stories remind us of the resilience of ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. Its consequences remind us that peace is never permanent. It must be actively defended, cultivated, and renewed. In the end, the First World War was not just about nations or armies. It was about humanity itself, its capacity for destruction, but also its capacity for survival and remembrance. To study the Great War is to confront the darkest depths of human conflict, but also to glimpse the enduring hope that even in the aftermath of devastation, people can rebuild, remember, and strive to create a better world.